Nebraska, 1902. A cattle baron with 2 dead marriages and no heir stands in a dim warehouse where desperate women are sold like livestock. When bidding stalls at $20 for a woman doctors declared barren, Silas Redmond shocks the room with a single word: one. $1. One chance. One woman who would give him 7 children and change the American West forever. This is their story. A transaction that became a dynasty. Stay until the end and comment your city so I can see how far this incredible true story reaches across the world. The wind off the Missouri River cut through Council Bluffs like a promise of winter, carrying with it the smell of stockyards and desperation. Silas Redmond stood in the shadows of Morton's warehouse, his broad shoulders draped in a coat that cost more than most men earned in a year, and watched humanity at its lowest ebb. He shouldn't have come. "Mr. Redmond, sir, you don't have to stay for this," his foreman, Dutch Kellerman, murmured beside him. Dutch was a good man, loyal, discreet, and currently looking anywhere but at the makeshift stage where women stood in a ragged line, each holding a handwritten card with a number. "We can leave right now. No one would think less of you." Silas said nothing. His pale gray eyes that men said could freeze a river in July, remained fixed on the proceedings. At 42, Silas Redmond was a man carved from Nebraska granite and cattle fortune. He owned 18,000 acres of prime grazing land, employed 63 men, and controlled livestock operations across 3 counties. Banks courted his deposits, politicians sought his endorsement, railroad magnates invited him to their private cars, and he was utterly, devastatingly alone. "Gentlemen!" The auctioneer, a greasy-haired man named Pritchard, clapped his hands together. "Let's continue, shall we? These fine women are seeking respectable marriages, and you fine gentlemen are seeking, well, companionship of the domestic variety. Everyone benefits from these arrangements. Everyone wins." Silas's jaw tightened. The euphemisms were almost more offensive than the naked truth. This was a meat market for human beings. Women with nowhere else to turn, men too desperate or damaged to find wives through conventional means. The matrimonial agency advertised discreetly in newspapers across the Midwest, promising practical unions for practical people. The women on that stage wore desperation like ill-fitting clothes. Some were too young, barely past girlhood. Others were weathered by hard years, their eyes hollow with hunger or grief. A widow clutching a baby, a girl with a healing black eye. Each held their numbered card with trembling or defiant hands, depending on what life had left them. "Number 7, Pritchard announced. "Miss Sarah Clemens, age 19, excellent cook, experience with children." "She pregnant?" someone called from the crowd. "I am not," the girl burst out, her face flaming red. "Then why ain't you married proper?" another voice jeered. Pritchard held up his hands. "Gentlemen, please, Miss Clemens comes from good Methodist stock. Her father's farm failed, and she seeks a respectable Christian marriage. Shall we start the bidding at $40? Silas turned to leave. This was madness. He'd come because Dutch had mentioned it casually 3 weeks ago. "Heard there's a marriage bureau in Council Bluffs, boss, if you're still considering," and because Silas had spent another sleepless night in his 14-room house with only the ticking of 7 different clocks for company. 2 marriages, 2 failures, 2 women who'd looked at his money with stars in their eyes, and at him with barely concealed revulsion. Catherine, his first wife, had lasted 14 months before dying of complications from a miscarriage. She'd been 17, the daughter of a railroad executive, and she'd cried every night for her mother. Silas had tried to be gentle with her, patient, but gentleness wasn't in his nature, and patience had its limits. When she died, he'd felt relief more than grief, and hated himself for it. Margaret, the second, had been a calculated choice. A 30-year-old widow from Omaha, practical and plain, who'd seemed like she understood what marriage to a man like Silas required. No romance, no illusions. She'd lasted 3 years before running off with a traveling salesman, leaving a note that said simply, "I cannot breathe in your shadow." After that, Silas had stopped trying. He built his empire instead, bought more land, bred better cattle, expanded his horse program, made money hand over fist. and went home every night to empty rooms and cold dinners and the slow, crushing realization that all his wealth couldn't buy what mattered most: an heir. Someone to carry forward what he'd built. Someone to justify the decades of brutal work, the sacrifices, the isolation. Boss. Dutch touched his elbow. Wait. I'm not buying a wife like a head of cattle, Dutch. Just look at number 12. Silas looked. She stood at the far end of the line, almost forgotten in the auctioneer's enthusiasm for younger prospects. Late 20s, perhaps 30. Tall for a woman, she'd meet his shoulder easily, with dark auburn hair pulled back in a simple bun. Her dress was mended but clean, her posture straight despite obvious exhaustion. But it was her face that caught him. Strong-boned, intelligent, with the kind of beauty that age would only sharpen rather than diminish. And her eyes. Even from across the warehouse, he could see they weren't the defeated eyes of the other women. They were watchful, assessing, calculating odds with the cold pragmatism of someone who'd stopped expecting mercy from the world. Number 12, Pritchard finally called, his enthusiasm notably dimmed. Mrs. Evelyn Mercer, age 28, widowed, experienced in household management and animal husbandry. Why is she on that stage if she's so damn capable? Someone interrupted. Evelyn's expression didn't change, but Silas saw her fingers tighten around her number card. Pritchard cleared his throat uncomfortably. Mrs. Mercer's late husband left her with debts rather than assets. She seeks a practical arrangement with a man of means who understands that matrimony is, at its core, a partnership of mutual benefit. What's wrong with her? Another voice demanded. Woman that age should have had 3 or 4 babies by now. She barren? The word hung in the air like smoke. Several men who'd been watching with interest immediately looked away. Barren. The kiss of death for a woman on this stage. No one wanted to pay good money for a wife who couldn't provide the most basic return on investment. The previous marriage was childless, Pritchard admitted reluctantly. However, she's barren, the heckler confirmed with satisfaction. Not worth $10. Silas watched Evelyn's face as the warehouse buzzed with dismissive chatter. She didn't flinch, didn't plead, didn't show any emotion at all. She simply stood there, holding her number card, waiting for whatever came next with the weary dignity of someone who'd endured worse humiliations and survived them. Something in that stillness called to him. $20, and Silas heard himself say. The warehouse went silent. Every head turned toward him. Silas Redmond, the cattle baron, the man who owned half the county and could have had his pick of eligible women from Omaha to Denver, was bidding on a barren widow. Pritchard recovered first. Mr. Redmond, yes, sir, $20 for number 12, an excellent choice, a woman of quality and experience. 15, someone countered nervously. I'll give 15. The bid stands at 20, Pritchard announced. Any advance on $20? Silence. Men shuffled their feet, glanced at Silas's imposing figure, and thought better of competing. Going once, going twice. Wait. Evelyn's voice cut through the warehouse, clear and steady. Before you finish that count, I need to say something. Pritchard blinked. Mrs. Mercer, that's not really how this... The gentleman has a right to know what he's buying. Evelyn looked directly at Silas for the first time, and he felt the impact of that gaze like a physical blow. Intelligence burned there, and something else, a core of absolute unbending honesty. I was married 4 years to Henry Mercer. We had no children. A doctor in Chicago told me my womb was tilted wrong, that I'd never conceive, but I'm not certain he was right. The warehouse erupted in murmurs. Women didn't speak about such things in public. Hell, women didn't speak about such things at all. I can read and write and keep accounts, Evelyn continued, her voice never wavering. I can manage a household of any size. I can butcher a hog, birth a calf, and nurse a man through pneumonia. I don't complain, I don't gossip, and I don't steal. But I cannot promise you children, sir. If that's what you need most, save your $20. Pritchard looked like he wanted to physically remove her from the stage. Several men were already turning away, heading for the door and muttering about wasted time. Silas stepped forward. The crowd parted instinctively. He'd been called intimidating, cold, brutal. Men who worked for him knew better than to meet his eyes when he was angry. He'd built his reputation on absolute control, zero tolerance for weakness, and the kind of ruthless efficiency that turned dirt into gold. He stopped directly in front of the stage. Evelyn didn't look away. "You believe the doctor was wrong?" Silas asked quietly. "I believe doctors are men," Evelyn replied. "And men are frequently wrong, but rarely uncertain." A ghost of something, amusement, respect, flickered across Silas's face. "What makes you think you could conceive?" "My mother bore 8 children. My grandmother bore 10. I was married to a man who drank himself sick most nights and who'd rather spend his seed in a whiskey glass than in his wife's bed." Her cheeks colored slightly, but her voice remained steady. "I'm not saying I can give you children, sir. I'm saying the evidence against it isn't conclusive." "Why are you here, Mrs. Mercer? Why this?" For the first time, emotion cracked through her composure. "Because when Henry died, his creditors took everything. The farm, the livestock, even my mother's wedding ring. Because I spent 3 months working at a laundry for wages that wouldn't feed a cat. Because winter's coming, and I have nowhere to go and no one to help me. Because this, sir, is the only door I have left." The warehouse was silent as a church. $20 is too much," Silas said. Evelyn's shoulders sagged slightly. She nodded once, accepting defeat with the same dignity she'd maintained throughout. $1, Silas continued. Every person in that warehouse gasped. Pritchard looked like he'd been slapped. Dutch made a small sound of surprise. $1, Silas repeated, his voice carrying to every corner. "Not because you're worth less than 20, Mrs. Mercer, but because I won't have anyone, including you, believe I purchased you like livestock. $1 makes this transaction exactly what it is, a legal technicality, a contract between 2 practical people entering a practical arrangement. If you accept that dollar, you accept a marriage of honesty and partnership. Nothing more. Nothing less." Evelyn stared at him. For a long moment, the only sound was the wind rattling the warehouse windows. "Do you want children, Mr. Redmond?" she asked. Desperately. "Then you should know that $1 or 20, I'll give you everything I have to try. But if my body won't cooperate, then we'll face that together," Silas interrupted. "As partners. Do you accept?" Evelyn looked at the warehouse, at the other women still standing on the stage, at Pritchard's scandalized face, at the men watching this strange negotiation with fascination and confusion. She looked at her number card, number 12, as if she were cattle herself, and then at Silas's extended hand. "I accept your dollar, Mr. Redmond," she said clearly, "and I'll make sure you never regret spending it." They shook hands like businessmen, and a ripple of stunned laughter ran through the crowd. Pritchard stammered something about paperwork and fees and customary procedures, but Silas cut him off with a single look. "We'll handle the legal requirements tomorrow," Silas said. "Tonight, Mrs. Mercer is tired, and I have a home to return to." He looked up at Evelyn. "Do you have belongings?" "A carpet bag, that's all." "That's all you need." 20 minutes later, Evelyn sat in the back of Silas's carriage, her carpet bag at her feet, watching Council Bluffs disappear into the darkness. Dutch drove, leaving Silas and Evelyn alone in the passenger compartment with a lantern swaying between them. For a long time, neither spoke. "I should tell you about the house," Silas finally said. "It's large, 14 rooms, most of them empty. I have a housekeeper, Mrs. Chen, who comes 3 times a week. She's competent but not warm. The cook, Martha, is warm but not particularly competent. You'll have full authority over household management if you want it, or you can leave things as they are." Evelyn nodded slowly. "What happened to your previous wives, Mr. Redmond?" "You heard about them." "Everyone's heard about them. 2 dead wives makes for good gossip." "Catherine died in childbirth. Margaret ran away with a salesman." Silas's voice was flat, emotionless. "Neither event was mysterious or suspicious, if that's what concerns you." "It doesn't concern me." Evelyn met his eyes. "I'm just trying to understand what kind of marriage you're expecting. Am I replacing Catherine or Margaret? Because I can't be a girl who cries for her mother, and I won't be a woman who suffocates in anyone's shadow." Silas studied her for a long moment. "What kind of marriage are you expecting, Mrs. Mercer?" "Honest work for honest compensation, respect for competence. And if I do give you children, sir, I expect them to know their mother is more than a brood mare." "Fair terms." Silas extended his hand again. We have an agreement. They shook a second time, and this time when Evelyn's work-roughened hand met his, something passed between them that felt dangerously like recognition. Two people who'd learned to survive without softness, meeting in the margins of a world that hadn't been kind to either of them. You can call me Silas, he said quietly. We're married, or will be tomorrow. Might as well use first names? Evelyn. I know. I was listening. The ghost of a smile touched Evelyn's lips. You paid attention to a barren widow on an auction stage. That makes you either extraordinarily kind or extraordinarily desperate. I'm not kind, Silas said. Then we're both desperate. Evelyn looked out at the darkness rushing past. That's something, at least. Desperation is honest. It's something else, too. Silas's voice was barely audible over the carriage wheels. It's the foundation of every great partnership. Two people with nothing to lose and everything to gain. Is that what we are now? Partners? That's what I paid my dollar for, Evelyn. The question is whether it's enough. The carriage rolled on through the Nebraska night, carrying them toward a house that would become a home, toward a transaction that would become a dynasty, toward a love neither of them had bargained for, but both would fight to keep. In the darkness, Evelyn's hand found Silas's and held it, not romantically, not tenderly, but with the firm grip of an equal acknowledging an equal. Partners in a dangerous venture. Survivors who'd found each other in the last place either expected. Your dollar is enough, she said finally. For now, that's enough. But both of them knew, even then, that nothing about this arrangement would stay simple. Nothing about these two complicated, damaged, desperate people could possibly remain transactional. The dollar was just the beginning. The Redmond house rose from the prairie like a monument to ambition. 3 stories of white clapboard and black shutters that caught the first light of dawn as the carriage rolled up the long drive. Evelyn had dozed fitfully during the final hours of the journey, her head resting against the carriage wall, and she woke to see her new home emerging from the morning mist like something from a fever dream. It's bigger than the hotel in Council Bluffs, she said quietly. Silas, who hadn't slept at all, looked at the house with the detached assessment of a man viewing property rather than home. It was built for a family, currently houses 1 man, a housekeeper, a cook, and enough empty rooms to echo. The carriage stopped at the front entrance, and Dutch climbed down to open the door. Evelyn stepped out onto gravel that crunched beneath her worn boots, feeling suddenly acutely aware of how she must look. Travel-stained, exhausted, carrying everything she owned in a single carpet bag. The front door opened, and a small Chinese woman in her 50s emerged, her face carefully neutral. Mrs. Chen, Silas said, his tone formal. This is Mrs. Mercer. We'll be married this afternoon at the courthouse. Please prepare the blue room for her use. Mrs. Chen's eyes flickered to Evelyn, taking in every detail with the swift efficiency of long practice. Yes, Mr. Redmond, will Mrs. Mercer require breakfast? I would appreciate that, Evelyn said before Silas could answer. Thank you. Something shifted in Mrs. Chen's expression, approval perhaps, or at least acknowledgement. She nodded once and disappeared back into the house. Silas gestured for Evelyn to follow, and she stepped across the threshold into her new life. The interior matched the exterior's ambitions: high ceilings, polished floors, furniture that looked expensive and uncomfortable. Everything was clean, orderly, and utterly devoid of personality. It was a house that had never been a home, rooms that had never heard children's laughter, or a woman singing, or any of the small sounds that made a space feel lived in rather than merely occupied. The parlor's there, Silas said, pointing to a room with stiff-backed chairs arranged like soldiers on parade. Dining room through that door. My office is off limits. I keep business records there. Kitchen's in the back. Upstairs are the bedrooms. The blue room has its own washroom. You'll have privacy. Evelyn turned to face him. And where do you sleep? Master bedroom, east wing, opposite end of the hall from the blue room. Quite a distance. That's intentional. Silas's jaw tightened. I won't force myself on you, Evelyn. You agreed to a practical arrangement. When and if we consummate this marriage, it'll be because we've both decided it's appropriate, not before. We want children, Evelyn said bluntly. That requires consummation. Putting me at the opposite end of the house seems counterproductive. A muscle jumped in Silas's cheek. I'm trying to be respectful. I appreciate that. But let's be clear about something. Evelyn set down her carpet bag and faced him squarely. I didn't accept your dollar to be treated like a piece of china that might break. I'm not Catherine, crying for her mother. I'm not Margaret, looking to suffocate. I'm a widow who understands exactly what marriage entails, including its more intimate aspects. If you want heirs, Silas, at some point you'll need to stop being quite so respectful. Silas stared at her. In 36 hours, he'd watched this woman stand on an auction block with dignity intact, negotiate her own sale with brutal honesty, spend a sleepless night in a carriage without complaint, and now calmly discuss conjugal relations in his front hallway as if she were talking about crop rotation. He'd expected many things from this arrangement. He hadn't expected to feel respect. You're not what I thought you'd be, he said finally. Neither are you. Evelyn picked up her carpet bag. Now, where's this blue room? I'd like to wash before breakfast, and we apparently have a wedding to attend this afternoon. Mrs. Chen appeared silently in the hallway, her face still carefully neutral. I'll show you upstairs, Mrs. Mercer. Evelyn followed her up the wide staircase, leaving Silas standing alone in his empty house, wondering what exactly he'd brought home from Council Bluffs. Not a desperate woman grateful for rescue. Not a submissive wife who'd fade into the wallpaper. Something else entirely. Something that might actually change the carefully controlled emptiness he'd built around himself. The thought should have terrified him. Instead, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Anticipation. The courthouse ceremony that afternoon was as practical and emotionless as their arrangement. Judge Whitmore, who'd handled legal matters for Silas for 15 years, performed the service with brisk efficiency in his chambers. Dutch and the court clerk served as witnesses. The whole affair took 7 minutes. You may kiss your bride, Judge Whitmore said without enthusiasm. Silas looked at Evelyn. She looked back. By unspoken agreement, they shook hands instead. That's not traditional, the judge observed. Neither is this marriage, Silas replied, but it's legal, which is all that matters. They signed the certificate, paid the fee, and left as Mr. and Mrs. Silas Redmond. In the carriage back to the house, Evelyn examined the simple gold band Silas had placed on her finger. He'd bought it that morning while she'd bathed and changed into the one good dress from her carpet bag. It fits, she said. I estimated. You have practical hands, not small, not large. Is that a compliment? It's an observation. Silas looked out the window at his land rolling past, thousands of acres of grass and cattle and wealth built from nothing. I'm not good at compliments, Evelyn. I'm good at observations, assessments, strategies. If you're expecting pretty words and romantic gestures, you'll be disappointed. I'm expecting honesty and respect, Evelyn said. Romance is for people who can afford illusions. We can't. No, Silas agreed quietly. We can't. That night, Evelyn learned the true geography of her new life. The house was even larger than she'd initially realized, with rooms that served no purpose and hallways that led nowhere in particular. She found the kitchen, where Martha, the cook, was a round woman in her 60s who looked delighted to finally have another woman in the house. Lord be praised, Martha said, wiping her hands on her apron. 13 years I've been cooking for that man, and he eats like he's taking medicine. No joy in it, no appreciation, just fuel. Maybe now we'll have actual meals instead of slabs of meat and boiled potatoes. Mr. Redmond doesn't care for elaborate food? Evelyn asked. Mr. Redmond doesn't care for anything that isn't cattle or land. Martha lowered her voice conspiratorially. Between you and me, Mrs. Redmond, that man needs more than a wife. He needs a reason to be human again. 2 dead marriages will do that to a person, turn them cold. But you look like you've got spine. Maybe you'll thaw him out. Evelyn wasn't sure about thawing, but she understood survival, and survival meant establishing her place in this household quickly and firmly. Over the next 3 days, she began quietly taking inventory of everything, supplies, schedules, inefficiencies. She watched how Mrs. Chen cleaned the same rooms over and over, because there was nothing else to clean. She noticed Martha preparing elaborate meals that Silas consumed without comment. She observed the ranch hands who came to the house for instructions, the way they spoke to Silas with respect but not warmth, fear but not loyalty. She saw an empire held together by one man's iron will, with no foundation beneath it except his own relentless control. On the fourth evening, she found Silas in his office, working by lamplight, though it was past 10 o'clock. She knocked on the doorframe. "You said this room was off limits," Silas said without looking up from his ledgers. "You also said I had authority over household management. I need to discuss accounts." Now he looked up. "What accounts?" Evelyn entered and placed a sheet of paper on his desk. "Martha's been ordering provisions for a household of 15. We're feeding 3 people and occasional ranch hands. Mrs. Chen is cleaning empty rooms twice a week that haven't been used in years. You're paying for services you don't need and wasting resources on maintenance that serves no purpose. I've calculated that we can reduce household expenses by 30% with no loss of quality or comfort." Silas studied the paper, his expression unreadable. "You've been here 4 days. Long enough to see waste, unless you enjoy spending money unnecessarily." "I don't enjoy anything unnecessarily." Silas set down his pen and leaned back in his chair, regarding her with those pale gray eyes. "You're proposing to take over household management entirely." "I'm proposing to do what I told you I could do, manage a household of any size. Right now, this household is managed for show rather than function. That might have made sense when you were trying to impress wives who cared about such things. I don't. I care about efficiency." A ghost of that almost smile touched Silas's face. "You're criticizing how I run my house." "I'm observing inefficiencies. Would you prefer I pretend not to notice them?" "No?" Silas pulled the paper closer, studying her neat columns of figures. "No, I wouldn't." "All right, Mrs. Redmond, the household is yours. Make whatever changes you see fit, but I'll expect those savings you promised. You'll get them." Evelyn turned to leave, then paused. "One more thing." "Yes?" "You can't build a legacy working 16-hour days and sleeping 4 hours a night. Whatever you're trying to prove to yourself, it's not sustainable. You need rest, proper meals, and occasional human interaction that doesn't involve cattle prices." Silas's expression hardened. "I'll manage my own schedule. And I'll manage the household, which includes ensuring its occupants remain healthy enough to occupy it. That's my job now, Silas. You hired me to do it. Let me." They stared at each other across the desk, neither willing to back down. Finally, Silas nodded once, curtly. "You're remarkably bold for a woman who arrived here with nothing but a carpet bag." "I didn't arrive with nothing," Evelyn replied. "I arrived with skills, intelligence, and an agreement that we'd be partners. Partners tell each other uncomfortable truths. Get used to it." She left him sitting there, and Silas found himself staring at the closed door with an emotion he couldn't quite identify. Irritation? Respect? Something else that felt dangerously close to admiration? The next morning he came down to breakfast and found the dining room transformed. Fresh flowers on the table, wild prairie roses that must have taken effort to find and arrange, curtains open to let in morning sun, and a meal that actually looked appetizing rather than merely nutritious. Eggs cooked with cream and herbs, fresh bread that was still warm, coffee that didn't taste like it had been boiled for hours. Evelyn sat across from him, calmly eating, as if this weren't a revolution. "Martha's pleased to finally cook properly," she said. "Mrs. Chen has been reassigned to projects that actually need doing, and I've given them both a half-day off each week. You were working them 7 days without respite. That's not efficiency, Silas. That's cruelty." Silas set down his fork. "You've been here less than a week and you're restructuring my entire household." "Yes. Is there a problem?" "No." He picked up his fork again, tasting the eggs. They were good. Better than good. When was the last time he'd actually enjoyed a meal? "No problem. Carry on, Mrs. Redmond." But that evening, when Evelyn retired to her room, she found a small package on her bed. Inside was a book, a new edition of agricultural science journals from the university. No note, no explanation, just an acknowledgement that she could read, that she was interested in such things, that someone had noticed. She sat on the edge of the bed, holding the book, and felt something crack in the careful walls she'd built around her heart. By the end of the second week, a rhythm had established itself. Silas rose at dawn and worked until evening, coming in for meals that Evelyn ensured were served at regular times. She managed the household with quiet efficiency, solving problems before they became crises, anticipating needs before they were voiced. The house slowly began to feel less like a museum and more like a place where people actually lived. But at night, they remained at opposite ends of the long hallway. The practical need that had brought them together, children, heirs, hung unspoken between them like fog. It was Evelyn who finally addressed it. She found Silas in the library one evening, reading reports by lamplight. She entered without knocking, closed the door behind her, and said simply, "We need to discuss the situation." Silas looked up warily. "What situation?" "The situation where we're married, supposedly trying for children, but haven't so much as touched each other beyond that handshake in Council Bluffs." Evelyn sat down in the chair across from him. "I understand you're trying to be respectful. I appreciate it. But at some point, respect becomes avoidance, and avoidance won't give you the airs you need." Silas's jaw tightened. "You want me to— what, exactly? Schedule conjugal relations like a business appointment?" "I want us to acknowledge that this aspect of our marriage can't be ignored indefinitely. We're adults. We understand biology. If I'm not barren, and we won't know unless we try, then trying requires certain actions." "Christ, Evelyn." Silas stood abruptly, walking to the window. "You talk about this like it's crop rotation. Would you prefer I blush and stammer and pretend to be shocked by the concept of marital intimacy?" Evelyn rose and joined him at the window. "I'm 28 years old. I was married for 4 years. I'm not ignorant, Silas, and I'm not fragile. What I am is practical." "Practical?" Silas laughed without humor. "Is that what we're calling it?" "What would you call it?" He turned to face her, and for the first time since they'd met, Evelyn saw genuine emotion in his eyes, frustration, desire, and underneath it all, something that looked like fear. "I would call it complicated," he said quietly. "Catherine was terrified of me. Every time I touched her, she flinched. Margaret tolerated it, but barely. She'd lie there like a corpse and count the minutes until I was finished. You talk about this like it's simple mathematics, but it's not. It's 2 people in a bed together, and I have no reason to believe I'll be any better at satisfying you than I was at satisfying them." The honesty of it struck Evelyn silent. She'd expected resistance, perhaps, or awkwardness, not this raw admission of inadequacy from a man who seemed unshakable in every other aspect of his life. "I wasn't happy in my marriage bed either," she said finally. "Henry was either drunk or angry or both. It was a duty I performed, nothing more. I don't expect poetry or passion from you, Silas. I expect the same thing I expect from every other aspect of our partnership: honest effort and mutual respect." "That's all?" "That's everything." Evelyn met his eyes steadily. "I don't need you to be a romantic hero. I need you to be a partner who's willing to try. We can figure out the rest as we go." Silas studied her face in the lamplight. She didn't look away, didn't blush, didn't give any indication that this conversation embarrassed or frightened her. Just practical, honest Evelyn, solving another problem with the same straightforward efficiency she applied to everything else. "All right," he said quietly. "When?" "That's up to you." "Tonight, then. If you're willing." Evelyn nodded once. "I'm willing." They stood there awkwardly for a moment, neither quite sure how to transition from negotiation to intimacy. Finally, Silas offered his hand, and Evelyn took it. Her palm was warm against his, roughened by work but steady. They walked together through the quiet house, up the stairs, past the empty rooms and silent hallways, to the master bedroom that Silas had occupied alone for so many years. He lit the lamp beside the bed with hands that weren't quite steady. Evelyn closed the door and began unfastening her dress with the practical efficiency she brought to every task. "Wait," Silas said. She paused, her hands on the buttons at her throat. "I want to do it," he said quietly. "If that's all right. I don't want this to feel like a transaction." "It is a transaction," Evelyn replied gently, "but that doesn't mean it can't be kind." She stood still as he approached, his large hands surprisingly gentle as they worked the buttons of her dress. He was careful, methodical, treating her clothing as if it were precious rather than the worn garments of a woman who'd arrived with nothing but a carpet bag. When her dress finally pooled at her feet and she stood in only her chemise and stockings, Silas's breath caught audibly. "What?" Evelyn asked. "You're beautiful," he said simply. "I should have said that before. You're beautiful, and I'm glad you're here." It wasn't poetry, but it was honest, and honesty was what they'd promised each other. Evelyn reached up and touched his face, feeling the roughness of his day-old beard, the tension in his jaw. "I'm glad too," she said. "Now show me that all this brooding intensity translates to something more useful than scaring ranch hands." He laughed, actually laughed, and the sound transformed his face into something younger, lighter. Then he kissed her, and Evelyn discovered that there was considerable difference between her first husband's sloppy, drunken attempts at affection and this careful, thorough attention from a man who did nothing by half measures. What happened next was awkward in places. They barely knew each other, after all, but also surprisingly tender. Silas proved to be a careful lover, attentive to her responses in a way that suggested he'd been telling the truth about his previous marriages. He hadn't known how to please them, but he was willing to learn, willing to wait, willing to try. And Evelyn, who'd spent 4 years enduring rather than enjoying her marital duties, discovered that partnership in bed worked the same way as partnership everywhere else, with honest communication, mutual respect, and the willingness to see each other as equals rather than opponents. Afterward, they lay in the darkness, not quite touching but no longer separated by the length of a hallway. "That wasn't terrible," Evelyn said, and felt Silas's chest shake with silent laughter. High praise. "I'm being honest. It wasn't terrible. Parts of it were actually quite good." "Which parts?" His voice held genuine curiosity rather than masculine pride. "The parts where you paid attention." Evelyn turned on her side to face him. "The parts where you acted like my pleasure mattered as much as yours." "It does matter." Silas reached out tentatively and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. "If we're going to do this, truly do this, it should matter to both of us." "Then we're in agreement." "We seem to be in agreement about a lot of things." His fingers traced the line of her jaw with surprising gentleness. "You're nothing like what I expected, Evelyn Redmond." "Neither are you, Silas Redmond." They fell asleep like that, not quite embracing but no longer strangers, two practical people who'd entered a practical arrangement and discovered that practicality didn't preclude tenderness. The next morning, Evelyn woke in the master bedroom as dawn light filtered through the curtains. Silas was already up, dressed, sitting in the chair by the window, watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "How long have you been staring at me?" she asked. "Not staring, observing." "And what have you observed?" "That you snore slightly, that you steal blankets, that you look younger when you sleep." He stood and came to sit on the edge of the bed. "Also that I'd like you to move your things from the blue room to here, if you're agreeable." Evelyn sat up, holding the sheet against her chest. "We've been married 2 weeks, Silas." "Which is 2 weeks of unnecessary distance between partners." His hand found hers beneath the blankets. "I'm not asking for love, Evelyn. I'm asking for proximity. I'm asking to wake up next to the person I'm building this life with. Is that too much?" "No," Evelyn said quietly. "No, that's not too much." So her things were moved, the single carpet bag that had held her entire life, now unpacked into drawers and closets next to Silas's expensive but austere clothing. The blue room stood empty once again, but this time the emptiness felt different. A door closing rather than opportunity wasted. As autumn deepened into winter, the household settled into new patterns. Evelyn ran the house with quiet authority, implementing changes that increased efficiency without sacrificing comfort. The ranch hands began coming to her with small questions rather than always bothering Silas. Martha's meals became events worth lingering over. Mrs. Chen began smiling occasionally, a rare sight that Silas attributed entirely to Evelyn's practical kindness. And at night, Silas and Evelyn explored their partnership in the privacy of the master bedroom, learning each other's bodies and rhythms with the same methodical attention they brought to everything else. It wasn't passion in the romantic sense, not the all-consuming fire that poets wrote about, but it was warm, comfortable, and increasingly satisfying for both of them. 6 weeks after the wedding, Evelyn missed her monthly courses. She waited another 2 weeks to be certain, consulting the medical books she'd found in Silas's library before saying anything. Then one morning at breakfast, she set down her fork and said simply, "I think I'm pregnant." Silas froze, his coffee cup halfway to his lips. "You're sure?" "As sure as I can be without a doctor's examination. All the signs are there." He set down the cup carefully, as if afraid any sudden movement might shatter the moment. The Chicago doctor was wrong, then. The Chicago doctor was an arrogant fool who made assumptions based on insufficient evidence. Evelyn's hand moved unconsciously to her stomach. Or perhaps I just needed the right partner. Something shifted in Silas's face. Joy, fear, hope, all tangled together in an expression so vulnerable it made Evelyn's throat tighten. This man, this cold cattle baron who terrified half the county, looked like he might cry. "We should get you to a doctor," he said, his voice rough. "A good one. From Omaha, or even Chicago if necessary. Someone who knows what they're doing." "Silas, women have been having babies since the beginning of time. You need the best care available." He stood abruptly, already planning. "I'll send Dutch to Omaha today. There's a physician there, Dr. Hartwell, who handled complicated cases for the governor's wife. He'll know what you need, how to ensure everything goes well." "Silas." Evelyn rose and took his hand, stopping his anxious planning. "Breathe. We have months yet. There's time." "Catherine died," he said bluntly. "She was pregnant, she was young and healthy, and she died anyway. I won't let that happen to you." "You can't control everything, Silas, not even with all your money and all your planning." "I can try." His hands tightened on hers. "I can damn well try." So Dr. Hartwell was summoned from Omaha, a competent man in his 50s who examined Evelyn thoroughly and pronounced her healthy, the pregnancy progressing normally, with no signs of the complications that had killed Catherine. He gave instructions for diet and rest, prescribed various tonics and supplements, and promised to return for monthly examinations. "Your wife is strong," he told Silas privately. "Good bones, good constitution. Barring unforeseen complications, she should do fine. But I'll be frank, Mr. Redmond, childbirth always carries risks. No amount of money or medical attention can eliminate them entirely." "Then we'll minimize them as much as possible," Silas replied. "Whatever she needs, doctor. Whatever it costs." But what Evelyn needed wasn't expensive medical care or elaborate precautions. She needed to work, to be useful, to maintain the sense of purpose that had sustained her through every hardship. The pregnancy barely slowed her down. She continued managing the household, though Silas tried repeatedly to convince her to rest more. "You're carrying my child," he argued. "You should be in bed with your feet elevated, not inventorying the pantry. Your child is the size of a plum and perfectly content to accompany me while I work," Evelyn replied. "I'm pregnant, Silas, not dying. Stop treating me like I'm made of glass." "I'm trying to take care of you." "Then take care of me by treating me like a partner, not a patient." It became a recurring argument between them. Silas's overwhelming need to protect warring with Evelyn's equally strong need for autonomy. But even their arguments had a warmth to them now, a foundation of mutual care that transformed disagreement into something almost affectionate. The ranch hands noticed the change in their boss. Silas still drove them hard, still demanded excellence, but there was less rage in it now. He came home for meals. He occasionally smiled. He even told a joke once, which shocked Dutch so thoroughly the foreman nearly fell off his horse. "Marriage agrees with you, boss," Dutch ventured one day as they surveyed the northern pastures. "Marriage to the right woman agrees with me," Silas corrected. "Turns out the problem wasn't marriage. It was choosing poorly." "You thinking Mrs. Redmond chose poorly too, ending up with a hard man like you?" Silas considered this seriously. "I think she chose survival. Everything else, including me, is a bonus she's choosing to make the most of. That's why it works, Dutch. We're both practical about what this is." But even as he said it, Silas knew it wasn't entirely true anymore. What had started as a practical arrangement was becoming something else, something that felt dangerously close to the partnership he'd claimed to want, but had never actually believed possible. Winter arrived with brutal cold and heavy snows that isolated the ranch for days at a time. Evelyn, now noticeably pregnant, spent evenings in the library with Silas, the two of them working companionably on different projects. Him with his ledgers and breeding records, her with the household accounts, and the books she'd borrowed from his extensive collection. Sometimes they talked. Sometimes they sat in comfortable silence. Always, Silas found his attention drifting from his work to watch her, the way lamplight caught in her auburn hair, the unconscious way her hand rested on her growing belly, the small smile that curved her lips when she found something particularly interesting in her reading. "You're staring again," she said without looking up. "Observing. And what are you observing now?" "That I'm a lucky man." The words came out before Silas could stop them, more honest than he'd intended. "That I paid $1 for the best investment I ever made." Evelyn finally looked up, her eyes soft in the lamplight. "That's almost romantic, Mr. Redmond." "Don't get used to it. I'm still not good at pretty words." "No," she agreed, setting aside her book and rising with some effort. The pregnancy was making her movements slower, more careful. "But you're getting better at honest ones." She crossed to his desk and held out her hand. Silas took it, letting her pull him to his feet, and followed her from the library to the bedroom they now shared without question or hesitation. And there, in the privacy of their partnership, they continued the slow, complicated process of turning a transaction into something that looked remarkably like love, even if neither of them was quite ready to call it that. Because calling it love would mean admitting vulnerability, admitting need, admitting that this practical arrangement had become the most important thing in both their carefully constructed lives. And neither of them was quite ready for that truth yet. But it was coming, as inevitable as spring after winter, as certain as the child growing in Evelyn's womb. The dollar had bought them a beginning. What they built from that beginning would cost them both far more, and give them everything they'd never dared to dream of asking for. The baby came on a brutally cold March morning, 3 weeks earlier than Dr. Hartwell had predicted. Silas was in the south pasture dealing with a fence break when Dutch came galloping across the frozen ground, his horse's breath streaming white in the air. "Boss, Mrs. Chen says it's time. The baby's coming." Silas didn't remember the ride back to the house. One moment he was in the pasture, the next he was bursting through the front door, his heart hammering against his ribs like it wanted to escape his chest. Martha met him in the hallway, her face flushed from running up and down the stairs. "Dr. Hartwell's not here yet," she said breathlessly. "Dutch sent someone to fetch him, but with these roads—" "Where is she?" Silas demanded. "Upstairs. Mrs. Chen's with her, and I've got water boiling, but Mr. Redmond, she's asking for you." Silas took the stairs 3 at a time. He found Evelyn in their bedroom, pacing beside the bed with one hand pressed to her lower back and the other gripping the bedpost. Mrs. Chen hovered nearby with an armful of clean linens, her normally impassive face tight with worry. "You're not supposed to be here," Evelyn said when she saw him, her voice strained. "Men don't attend births." "Men who paid $1 for their wives can damn well attend anything they please." Silas crossed to her side. "How bad is it?" "It's childbirth, Silas. It's supposed to hurt." Another contraction hit, and Evelyn's fingers tightened on the bedpost until her knuckles went white. She breathed through it with gritted teeth, and Silas felt absolutely, utterly helpless. He could negotiate million-dollar cattle deals without breaking a sweat. He could stare down rustlers and rival ranchers and railroad barons. But watching Evelyn in pain unmanned him completely. "Dr. Hartwell will be here soon," he said, knowing it was useless comfort. "The baby doesn't care about Dr. Hartwell's schedule." Evelyn's laugh was half-gasp. "Mrs. Chen, how many births have you attended?" 7, the housekeeper replied. "In China before I came here." "Then you know what to do better than any of us. Tell me what you need." Mrs. Chen's expression shifted from worry to determination. She began issuing rapid instructions to Martha, who hurried to comply. Silas stood frozen until Evelyn reached out and gripped his hand with surprising strength. "Don't you dare faint," she said. "I need you here. I need you solid." "I'm here." He brought her hand to his lips. "I'm not going anywhere." The next 4 hours were the longest of Silas's life. Dr. Hartwell arrived after 2, took one look at the situation, and declared that Mrs. Chen had everything well in hand. The birth was progressing normally, though slowly. All they could do was wait and let nature take its course. Silas hated waiting. He hated being unable to fix or control or manage what was happening, but he stayed at Evelyn's side, letting her grip his hand hard enough to leave bruises, wiping her forehead with cool cloths, murmuring encouragement that felt inadequate but was all he had to offer. "This is your fault," Evelyn gasped at one point, and Silas couldn't tell if she was serious or attempting humor through the pain. "I know. I'm sorry." "Don't be sorry. Just promise me." She broke off as another contraction seized her. "Promise me if something happens, you'll take care of the baby." "Nothing's going to happen," Silas said fiercely. "You're strong, Evelyn. Stronger than anyone I've ever known. You're going to come through this, and we're going to raise this child together. Promise me anyway." "I promise. But you're going to be fine. You have to be fine." His voice cracked. "I can't do this without you." Evelyn's eyes met his, and something passed between them that didn't need words. Then Mrs. Chen was there, telling Evelyn it was time to push, and everything else fell away. The baby boy arrived just as the sun was setting, filling the room with golden light and lusty cries. Dr. Hartwell caught him, cleared his airways, and placed him on Evelyn's chest while she sobbed with relief and exhaustion. "He's perfect," the doctor announced. 10 fingers, 10 toes, excellent lungs. "Congratulations, Mr. and Mrs. Redmond." Silas stared at his son, and felt something fundamental shift in his understanding of the world. This tiny red-faced creature who was wailing his displeasure at being born represented everything Silas had worked for, everything he'd built, everything he'd hoped to achieve. An heir, a legacy, a future. "He needs a name," Evelyn said softly, her fingers exploring the baby's downy head. "What do you want to call him?" "I was thinking Thomas, after my father." She looked up at Silas. "If that's acceptable." "Thomas Redmond." Silas reached out tentatively and touched his son's tiny fist. The baby's fingers immediately wrapped around one of his, and Silas felt his throat tighten. "It's perfect." Dr. Hartwell finished attending to Evelyn, declared her recovery excellent, and left detailed instructions for the coming weeks. Martha and Mrs. Chen fussed over the new mother and baby with obvious delight. Dutch and the ranch hands celebrated in the bunkhouse with whiskey and cigars, and Silas sat beside the bed where his wife and son slept, watching them in the lamplight and wondering how his carefully controlled life had been so thoroughly, wonderfully demolished by a woman he'd bought for $1. The whispers started 3 weeks later. Silas first heard them at the bank in town, where he'd gone to discuss expanding his breeding program. Henry Morrison, who'd been handling Redmond accounts for a decade, mentioned it casually while they reviewed documents. "Congratulations on the new arrival, by the way. Fast work, wasn't it? You were only married, 6 months?" "7, Silas replied, his voice cold. "My son was born on time." Of course. Morrison's smile was greasy. "Just that people have been counting months, you understand. Wondering if perhaps Mrs. Redmond was already, in the family way when you married her. Would explain that unusual auction business." Silas's hand flattened on the desk with enough force to make Morrison jump. "Are you suggesting my wife was pregnant with another man's child?" "I'm not suggesting anything, just repeating what's being said around town. You know how people talk." "Then you can tell people that my wife was examined by Dr. Hartwell himself, who confirmed she was not pregnant when we married. You can also tell them that anyone who continues to spread such slander will find themselves dealing with me personally. Am I clear?" Morrison paled. "Perfectly clear, Mr. Redmond." But the rumors persisted, mutating as they spread. Evelyn was a fortune hunter who'd trapped Silas with false claims of barrenness. Evelyn had been pregnant already and lied about it. Evelyn was a woman of loose morals who'd been sold at auction because no respectable man would have her. The stories grew more elaborate and more vicious with each telling. Evelyn heard them too, though not from Silas, who tried to shield her from the worst of it. Martha let something slip one afternoon while helping with the baby, quickly trying to cover her mistake, but Evelyn's sharp mind had already caught the implication. "What are people saying about me?" she asked directly. Martha's face flushed. "Just nonsense, ma'am. Small-minded people with nothing better to do." "Tell me." So Martha told her, haltingly and apologetically. When she finished, Evelyn sat quietly for a moment, nursing Thomas, her face unreadable. "I see," she said finally. "Thank you for being honest with me, Martha." That evening, she confronted Silas in his office. "Why didn't you tell me what people were saying?" "Because it's vicious gossip that doesn't deserve your attention." Silas set down his pen. "I've been handling it. By threatening people at the bank? Morrison had no right. Morrison is a petty man who repeats what he hears. The problem isn't him, Silas. It's that people are counting months and questioning our son's legitimacy." Evelyn's voice was steady, but he could see the hurt underneath. "They're saying I'm a whore who trapped you. Anyone who says that, within my hearing, will regret it. Violence won't solve this." She sat down across from him. "We need a different approach. Dr. Hartwell examined me when we married. He can provide documentation that I wasn't pregnant. We can make that public, put the rumors to rest." "No." Silas's voice was flat. "We're not subjecting you to that humiliation. We're not parading your medical history for public consumption to satisfy gossips and scandalmongers." "Then what do you suggest? Letting them keep whispering? Letting our son grow up with questions about his birth?" "I suggest we ignore them. We know the truth. That's all that matters." "You're wrong." Evelyn leaned forward. "Truth only matters if people believe it. Right now they believe I'm either a liar or a whore, and that our marriage is built on deception. That affects you, Silas. It affects your business, your reputation, everything you've built." "I don't give a damn about my reputation." "Yes, you do. And more importantly, I give a damn about mine." She stood. "I won't be reduced to a cautionary tale. I won't be the woman people pity or condemn. I'm your wife, the mother of your child, and I have just as much right to respect as you do." They stared at each other across the desk, at an impasse. Evelyn left the office with her spine straight and her head high, but Silas could see the weight she carried. The knowledge that no matter what they did, some people would always question her character, her motives, her worth. That night, as they lay in bed with Thomas sleeping in his cradle nearby, Silas pulled Evelyn close. "I should have protected you from this," he said quietly. "I should have anticipated it. You can't protect me from everything. That's not how partnership works." Evelyn's head rested on his chest, her breath warm against his skin. "But Silas, we need to make a decision. Either we fight these rumors publicly, or we prove them wrong through our actions. I prefer the latter." "What do you mean?" "I mean we live our lives so openly, so honestly, that the gossip withers for lack of fuel. I'll attend church socials. I'll join the Ladies' Aid Society. I'll become so visible and so irreproachable that people will feel foolish forever doubting me." "You want to subject yourself to those vultures?" "I want to show them who I am, rather than letting them decide for themselves." She lifted her head to look at him. "Unless you'd prefer I hide here on the ranch, like some kind of guilty secret?" "You're not a secret. You're my wife." "Then let me be your wife in public, not just in private." So Evelyn began attending church every Sunday, holding her head high while women whispered behind their hands. She joined the Ladies' Aid Society, volunteering for the most menial tasks without complaint. She brought Thomas to town, letting people see the healthy, legitimate child of a healthy, legitimate marriage. And slowly, grudgingly, the tide began to turn. It helped that Evelyn was genuinely good at the work she took on. She organized the church fundraiser with such efficiency that they raised twice the expected amount. She personally nursed the banker's wife through influenza, earning Morrison's sheepish gratitude. She befriended the wives of Silas's business associates, demonstrating intelligence and competence that made her hard to dismiss or condemn. But there were still holdouts, still people who wanted to believe the worst. It came to a head at the Founders' Day celebration in June. Evelyn had organized much of the event, working with the other society women to create a festival that brought the whole county together. She'd been looking forward to it, seeing it as a final chance to prove herself to the community. She wore her best dress, still simple compared to what the wealthier women wore, but clean and well-fitted, and carried Thomas proudly. Everything was going well until Charlotte Pemberton arrived. Charlotte was old money, the daughter of the original railroad magnate who'd helped found the county. She'd been away at finishing school when Silas married Catherine, and abroad when he married Margaret. This was her first time meeting Evelyn, and she made her opinions clear immediately. "So you're the auction bride," Charlotte said loudly enough for a dozen people to hear. She looked Evelyn up and down with undisguised contempt. "How much did Silas pay for you, dear? I heard it was only $1. Bargain shopping, even for him." Evelyn felt every eye turn toward her. The festival noise seemed to fade, leaving only Charlotte's mocking voice and the weight of public judgment. "Actually, it was exactly $1, Evelyn replied calmly. "And I'd say both Silas and I got considerably more than we bargained for." "How brave of you to admit it." Charlotte's smile was vicious. Most women would be ashamed to confess they were purchased like cattle. But then, you were desperate, weren't they? No family, no prospects, damaged goods. That's enough. The voice came from behind Evelyn, and she turned to see Susan Whitmore, the judge's wife. Susan was in her 60s, respected throughout the county, and currently looking at Charlotte with the kind of disapproval that could wither crops. "Charlotte Pemberton, you should be ashamed of yourself. Mrs. Redmond has worked tirelessly on this festival while you were off spending your father's money in Europe. She's earned respect, not your juvenile cruelty." "I'm simply speaking the truth," Charlotte began. "The truth is that Silas Redmond married a woman of intelligence and capability," Susan interrupted. "Something neither of his previous marriages could claim. The truth is that Mrs. Redmond has contributed more to this community in 6 months than you have in your entire privileged life. And the truth, Charlotte, is that your jealousy is showing, and it's quite unbecoming." Other women began murmuring agreement. Margaret Chen, who'd become friendly with Evelyn through the Ladies' Aid Society, stepped forward to stand beside her. Then Mary Sullivan, then Elizabeth Morrison, even the banker's wife, who owed Evelyn her life. Charlotte found herself suddenly surrounded by women who'd decided that Evelyn Redmond deserved their loyalty more than old prejudices deserved their maintenance. "Well," Charlotte said, her face flushed, "I can see where allegiances lie. I hope you all enjoy your festival." She swept away, her exit considerably less triumphant than her entrance. Susan turned to Evelyn with a kind smile. "Don't let that girl upset you, dear. She's been spoiled rotten since birth and can't stand anyone getting attention that isn't directed at her." "I'm not upset," Evelyn said, and realized it was true. "I'm actually quite touched. Thank you, Mrs. Whitmore." "Call me Susan, and you're welcome, though I only spoke the truth." Susan glanced at Thomas, who'd slept through the entire confrontation. "Now, shall we get back to this festival you worked so hard on? I believe the pie judging is about to start, and I have it on good authority that your apple pie is the one to beat." The rest of the day passed in a blur of activity and fellowship. Word of Charlotte's humiliation spread quickly, and people went out of their way to be kind to Evelyn, as if apologizing for having doubted her. By the time Silas found her in the evening, surrounded by chattering women and passed-around babies, Evelyn looked tired but genuinely happy. "You should have seen her, Mr. Redmond," Margaret Chen said excitedly. Charlotte Pemberton tried to embarrass her in front of everyone, and Mrs. Redmond just stood there so dignified and calm. And then Susan Whitmore put that awful girl right in her place. "It wasn't that dramatic," Evelyn protested, but she was smiling. Silas looked at his wife, his partner, holding their son and standing among women who'd chosen to defend her, and felt something fierce and proud swell in his chest. She'd done exactly what she said she would. She'd proven herself through action rather than argument, earned respect through competence rather than demanding it. That night, after Thomas was asleep and they were alone in their room, Silas pulled Evelyn into his arms. "You were right," he said simply, "about handling the gossip your way. I should have trusted you. You were trying to protect me. That's not wrong, Silas. It's just not always possible." She rested her head on his shoulder. "But I think we've turned a corner. People are starting to see me as I am rather than what they imagined." "They see a woman who's stronger than I am," Silas said quietly. "You faced them down without flinching. I would have just threatened them." Different approaches for different situations. Evelyn pulled back to look at him. "That's what partnership means. You handle the things that require intimidation. I handle the things that require diplomacy. Together, we're formidable." "Formidable," Silas repeated, a smile tugging at his lips. "That's one word for it." "What word would you use?" He kissed her instead of answering, and the kiss spoke volumes that words would have made clumsy. gratitude and pride and affection and something deeper that neither of them was quite ready to name. But it was there, growing stronger with each shared challenge, each moment of partnership, each discovery that what they'd built was far more than a transaction. 6 months later, Evelyn was pregnant again. Thomas was just learning to walk, tottering around the house with Mrs. Chen following anxiously behind him when Evelyn confirmed her suspicions. This time, there was no dramatic announcement, no worry about whether it would work. Just a quiet conversation in their bedroom one evening. "It seems our partnership continues to be productive," she said with dry humor. Silas, who'd been removing his boots, froze. "You're certain?" "As certain as I was with Thomas. All the same signs." She came to sit beside him on the bed. "Dr. Hartwell says I'm healthy, the pregnancy is progressing normally, and I should expect another spring delivery. 2 children in 2 years. Silas shook his head in wonder. "The Barren woman gives me 2 sons. We don't know it's a son yet." "Daughter, then." "I'm not particular." He reached out to touch her still flat stomach. "Are you happy about this?" Evelyn considered the question seriously. "I'm content. Thomas is wonderful but exhausting. Another baby so soon will be challenging. But yes, I'm happy. This is what we wanted, isn't it? A family?" "It is." Silas pulled her closer. "Though I worry about you, the last birth was difficult." "All births are difficult. That's the nature of creating life." She kissed his cheek. "But I'm stronger now than I was then. I know what to expect, and I have you." "You'll always have me," Silas said, and meant it with an intensity that surprised them both. The second pregnancy progressed more easily than the first, perhaps because Evelyn knew what to expect, perhaps because she was distracted by Thomas's boundless energy. She continued managing the household, though she grudgingly accepted more help from Martha and Mrs. Chen as she grew larger. But it was during this pregnancy that Evelyn began to take a real interest in Silas's horse breeding program. She'd always been intelligent about livestock. She'd mentioned animal husbandry at that first auction, after all. But she'd focused primarily on household management in her first year of marriage. Now, with systems in place and staff she trusted, Evelyn found herself with time to explore other aspects of the ranch. She started by simply observing. She'd walk down to the stables with Thomas, letting him pet the gentle mares while she watched the breeding program with assessing eyes. Silas noticed her interest and began explaining his methods, bloodlines he was developing, traits he was trying to enhance, the careful record-keeping that tracked each animal's lineage and performance. "You're thinking something," he said one afternoon, watching her frown at the breeding charts. "I'm thinking you're focused entirely on physical traits," Evelyn replied. "Size, strength, speed. But what about temperament?" "Temperament? A horse can be magnificent physically, but worthless if it's too skittish or aggressive to train properly. You're breeding for power, but power needs to be manageable." She pointed to one of the charts. "The stallion you're planning to use, he's thrown 3 foals that were so high-strung they had to be sold at a loss. Yet you keep using him because his conformation is perfect." Silas looked at the chart with new eyes. "I never thought about it that way." "Because you're approaching this like a man who wants impressive livestock. I'm approaching it like a woman who needs animals that can actually be used." Evelyn's hand moved to her swelling belly. "If you want to build a breeding program that's truly valuable, you need horses that combine physical excellence with trainability, otherwise you're just producing beautiful problems." It was like a door opening in Silas's mind. Evelyn was right. He'd been so focused on creating impressive specimens that he'd overlooked the practical requirements of the people who'd actually buy and use those horses. Over the next weeks, he found himself increasingly consulting her on breeding decisions, valuing her instinct for balance and practicality that complemented his drive for excellence. "You have a gift for this," he told her one evening as they reviewed breeding records together. "I have a gift for seeing what's actually needed rather than what's impressive," Evelyn corrected. "It's the same skill I use managing the household. Efficiency and results matter more than show." "Then I want you managing the breeding program with me. Not just advising, actually running it alongside me." Evelyn looked up from the records, surprised. "Silas, women don't run cattle operations, I know. But this is horse breeding, not cattle. It's considered more genteel. And more importantly, you're better at it than I am in some ways. Why would I ignore that advantage because of arbitrary rules about what women can and can't do? Your business associates won't like it. My business associates can adjust their expectations or take their business elsewhere. Silas's voice was firm. You're my partner, Evelyn, in everything. That includes the parts of this ranch that actually interest you. So Evelyn became involved in the breeding program, and it transformed under her practical influence. They began selecting for temperament alongside physical traits, creating horses that were not only beautiful, but reliably trainable. Word spread, and buyers began specifically requesting Redmond horses for their combination of quality and manageability. The operation was thriving when Evelyn went into labor with their second child in April of 1904. This birth was faster than the first, but more difficult. The baby was larger, the labor more intense, and there came a moment, a terrible, endless moment, when Dr. Hartwell's face went tight with worry, and Silas felt his heart stop in his chest. "What's wrong?" he demanded. "The baby's turned wrong. Shoulder presentation." Dr. Hartwell was already rolling up his sleeves. "Mrs. Redmond, I need you to stop pushing for a moment. I need to turn the baby manually, and it's going to hurt." "Do it," Evelyn gasped. "Just do it." What followed was the worst hour of Silas's life. Evelyn's screams seemed to echo off the walls, and there was blood, so much blood, and Dr. Hartwell working with grim determination while Mrs. Chen held Evelyn's hand and whispered encouragement in Chinese. "I can't," Evelyn sobbed at one point. "I can't. It hurts too much." "You can," Silas said fiercely, gripping her other hand. "You're the strongest person I know, Evelyn. You're going to do this. You're going to bring our baby into this world, and then you're going to recover, and we're going to raise our children together. You hear me? Together." "Together," Evelyn whispered, and found the strength for one more push. The baby girl arrived in a rush of fluid and blood and desperate crying. Dr. Hartwell caught her, cleared her airways, and placed her on Evelyn's chest while he and Mrs. Chen worked frantically to stem the bleeding. "She's beautiful," Evelyn said weakly, her face gray with exhaustion and blood loss. "Silas, she's—" "Don't talk," Silas ordered, his voice rough with fear. "Save your strength. Dr. Hartwell, will she—" "The bleeding is stopping," the doctor said, though he didn't look up from his work. "But Mrs. Redmond has lost a significant amount of blood. The next few hours are critical." Those hours crawled past like years. The baby, whom they named Sarah after Evelyn's mother, nursed briefly, then fell asleep in a cradle beside the bed. Thomas was kept downstairs with Martha, blessedly unaware of the crisis. And Silas sat beside Evelyn's bed, holding her hand and praying to a God he'd never much believed in. "Don't you dare leave me," he whispered when she was barely conscious. "Don't you dare, Evelyn Redmond. I can't do this alone. I don't want to do this alone. I need you." Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused. "Bossy. Damn right I'm bossy. That's why you married me." "Married you for $1. The ghost of a smile touched her pale lips. "Best investment I ever made." "Same," Silas said, his throat tight. "Same, love." The endearment slipped out unintended, raw and honest. Evelyn's eyes widened slightly, then closed again, but her hand tightened on his. "Love," she murmured, "took you long enough to say it." Then she slept, and Silas sat beside her through the night, holding her hand and finally admitting what he'd been denying for months. He loved her. Loved this practical, strong, infuriating woman who'd stood on an auction block and agreed to a marriage for $1. Loved her intelligence and her competence and her refusal to be diminished by circumstance. Loved the way she'd transformed his empty house into a home, his cold existence into a life worth living. Loved her with an intensity that terrified him because it meant she had the power to destroy him simply by leaving. But she didn't leave. As dawn broke, her color improved. By afternoon, she was sitting up and nursing Sarah with Martha's help. By evening, Dr. Hartwell pronounced her out of danger, though he warned that another pregnancy might be fatal. "No more children," the doctor said bluntly to Silas in the hallway. "Mrs. Redmond is strong, but she's not indestructible. Another difficult birth could kill her." Then there won't be another birth, Silas replied. 2 children is enough. But when he returned to the bedroom and found Evelyn sitting up with Sarah in her arms and Thomas climbing onto the bed beside them, he felt the sharp ache of loss even as he celebrated their survival. 2 children when he'd wanted a house full. 2 when he dreamed of a dynasty. Evelyn saw it in his face. You wanted more. I want you alive more than I want more children. Silas sat carefully on the edge of the bed. Dr. Hartwell says, I know what he says. I heard. She looked down at Sarah's tiny face. I'm sorry, Silas. For what? For nearly dying to give me a daughter? He tilted her chin up gently. You have nothing to apologize for, Evelyn. Nothing. We have 2 healthy children and each other. That's more than I ever expected to have. But your empire can be run by Thomas when he's grown, or Sarah, if she has the mind for it, or we can sell it off and live comfortably on the proceeds. Silas's voice was fierce. I don't care, Evelyn. None of it matters if you're not here to share it with me. Tears spilled down her cheeks. You love me. I love you, he confirmed, the words easier now that he'd admitted them. I've loved you for months, probably. I was just too stubborn to acknowledge it. Why now? Because I almost lost you. Because I realized that everything I've built, the land, the cattle, the horses, all of it, means nothing without you. He kissed her forehead gently. You're my partner in everything, Evelyn. But more than that, you're my love. The only one I've ever had. The only one I'll ever want. That's the most romantic thing you've ever said to me. Don't get used to it, Silas replied, but he was smiling through his own tears. I'm still not good at pretty words. No, Evelyn agreed, reaching up to touch his face. But you're getting better at honest ones. And I love you too, Silas Redmond. I think I have for a while. I was just too practical to say it. They sat together like that, their children between them, and acknowledged what their dollar transaction had become. Not just a partnership, not just a convenient arrangement, but something far more valuable and far more dangerous. Love. Messy and complicated and absolutely essential. The foundation for everything they would build together in the years to come. Recovery was slow and painful, a fact that frustrated Evelyn more than the physical discomfort itself. She'd always prided herself on strength and capability, and now she found herself weak as a kitten, dependent on others for basic tasks. Martha brought meals to the bedroom. Mrs. Chen handled the baby's washing and changing when Evelyn was too exhausted to manage. Even Thomas, barely 2 years old, seemed to understand something was wrong with Mama, climbing carefully onto the bed to pat her hand with his chubby fingers. Better? He'd ask hopefully, and Evelyn would force a smile and assure him that yes, Mama was getting better. But privately, to Silas, she admitted her fears. What if I can't do it anymore? She said one night, her voice barely above a whisper. Sarah was asleep in her cradle, and Thomas had been settled in the nursery down the hall. What if I can't manage the household? Can't help with the horses? Can't be the partner you need? Silas, who'd been reading breeding records by lamplight, set the papers aside immediately. You nearly died 3 weeks ago, Evelyn. The fact that you're conscious and talking is a miracle. The rest will come. But what if it doesn't? What if this is who I am now? Weak and useless? You're neither of those things. He moved to sit beside her on the bed, taking her hand carefully. You're healing. That takes time. And even if you never manage the household the same way again, even if you never step foot in the stables, you're still my wife, still the woman I love, still the mother of my children. Your worth isn't measured by your productivity, Evelyn. Isn't it? She laughed bitterly. That's how you chose me. That's what our arrangement was built on, my ability to be useful. That was before. Silas's voice was firm. Before I knew you, before I understood what we were building together. Yes, I initially valued your competence. Now I value you. There's a difference. Words are easy, Silas. Then let me prove it with actions. He stood and crossed to his desk, returning with a leather portfolio. I've been working on something while you've been recovering. I want you to look at it. Evelyn opened the portfolio and found herself staring at legal documents. It took her a moment to understand what she was reading, and when she did, her hands started shaking. This is a deed, she said slowly, to the eastern pasture land. In my name. 500 acres, Silas confirmed, and not just land. The documents behind it establish your personal ownership of the horse breeding program, separate from my cattle operations. You'll have full authority over breeding decisions, sales, profits. It's yours, Evelyn, not ours. Yours. I don't understand. Why would you? Because I've been thinking about what Dr. Hartwell said. About how another pregnancy could kill you, about how we need to be more careful. Silas's jaw tightened. I've been thinking about Catherine, who died with nothing to her name except what I'd given her, about Margaret, who left with only the clothes on her back because legally everything belonged to me. I don't want that for you, Evelyn. If something happens to me, I want you to be secure, and if something happens to you, his voice cracked slightly. If something happens to you, I want you to know that you built something, that you weren't just my wife, but your own person with your own achievements. Evelyn stared at the documents, tears streaming down her face. In 1904, women had virtually no property rights. Everything she'd built, everything she'd contributed, legally belonged to Silas. This deed, these papers, represented something revolutionary. Acknowledgement of her as an equal partner, not just in word but in law. This is the most extraordinary gift anyone has ever given me, she whispered. It's not a gift. It's recognition of what you've earned. Silas sat beside her again. You transformed my breeding program, Evelyn. The reputation we're building, the quality of our stock, the prices we're commanding, that's your doing as much as mine. Maybe more. You deserved a profit from your own work. Society will think you're mad, giving land and business ownership to your wife. Society thought we were mad for getting married at all, Silas interrupted. I stopped caring about society's opinion when I paid $1 for the best thing that ever happened to me. Evelyn set the portfolio aside carefully and reached for him, pulling him into an embrace that was awkward given her weakness but desperately needed. I love you, she said fiercely. I love you so much it terrifies me. Good, Silas murmured against her hair. Because you terrify me too, in the best possible way. By summer, Evelyn had regained most of her strength, though she tired more easily than before and occasionally had to rest in the afternoons. But her mind was as sharp as ever, and she threw herself into developing the horse breeding program with renewed passion. The deed in her name wasn't just a symbol, it was a responsibility she took seriously. She began keeping meticulous records, tracking not just physical traits, but behavioral patterns across bloodlines. She corresponded with breeders in other states, exchanging information and expanding her knowledge. She visited other ranches to observe their methods, occasionally taking Thomas with her, teaching him to evaluate horses even at his young age. That one's too nervous, Thomas would announce solemnly, pointing at a skittish mare, and Evelyn would smile because he'd learned to recognize the same signs she looked for. The breeding program flourished under her management. Within a year, Redmond horses were commanding premium prices across 3 states, known for their exceptional combination of beauty and trainability. Buyers specifically requested to work with Mrs. Redmond, and Evelyn found herself negotiating deals that would have been impossible for most women. But success bred resentment, especially from men who didn't appreciate a woman operating so visibly in what they considered male territory. The crisis came in the spring of 1906, when 3 valuable horses disappeared from the Redmond stables overnight. The theft itself was serious enough, but what happened next nearly destroyed everything they'd built. Silas was in Omaha on business when it happened, leaving Evelyn to handle the situation. She immediately notified the sheriff, organized search parties, and offered a substantial reward for information leading to recovery of the animals. The horses were found 3 days later at a ranch 40 miles south, and the owner, a man named Jack Dalton who'd competed unsuccessfully with Redmond stock at various shows, claimed he'd purchased them legitimately. I have a bill of sale, Dalton insisted, producing a document with what appeared to be Silas's signature. Paid $500 for the 3 of them, fair and square. The sheriff examined the bill of sale dubiously. This looks like Mr. Redmond's signature, but it's forged, Evelyn said flatly. She'd brought the ranch's financial records with her. We have no record of this transaction, no corresponding payment, and more importantly, those horses aren't for sale. They're breeding stock. Maybe your husband made a private deal and didn't tell you about it, Dalton suggested with a smirk. Maybe he doesn't share all his business with his wife. My husband shares everything with me, Evelyn replied coldly. We're partners. And even if he had decided to sell breeding stock, which he wouldn't do without consulting me, he'd never accept such a ridiculously low price. Those 3 horses are worth at least $2,000 combined. That's quite a claim, Mrs. Redmond. Got proof of their value? Evelyn produced another set of documents, breeding records, lineage information, sales comparisons. She'd come prepared, and Dalton's smirk began to fade as she systematically demolished his story. But the sheriff looked uncertain, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. This is a serious accusation, he said carefully. Horse theft's a hanging offense in some places. You're saying Mr. Dalton here is a thief based on your word against his bill of sale? I'm saying someone forged my husband's signature and sold stolen property to Mr. Dalton, Evelyn corrected. Whether Mr. Dalton was complicit in the theft or merely a buyer of stolen goods, I can't say. But those horses are ours, and we want them back. The matter went to court, which should have been straightforward, but Dalton's lawyer was clever, and he made the case about Evelyn rather than the stolen horses. Gentlemen of the jury, he said smoothly during his opening statement, we have here a woman who claims to manage a breeding operation, a woman who presumed to conduct business negotiations, handle financial records, and make decisions about valuable property. But is Mrs. Redmond actually competent to make such claims? Or is she a woman who's overstepped her bounds, perhaps made mistakes she's now trying to cover by accusing an innocent man of theft? Evelyn sat in the courtroom beside their lawyer, Marcus Webb, and felt rage building in her chest. This wasn't about the horses anymore. This was about whether a woman could be trusted to know her own business. They're putting you on trial instead of Dalton, Marcus muttered, trying to make this about your credibility rather than the facts. Then we'll have to make it about the facts, Evelyn replied. I want to testify. Mrs. Redmond, I'm not sure that's wise. I'm sure. Her voice was steel. Those are my horses, my breeding program, my reputation. I'm not letting some thief and his lawyer diminish what I've built because I'm a woman. When Evelyn took the stand the next day, Dalton's lawyer approached with barely concealed condescension. Mrs. Redmond, you claim to manage a horse breeding operation. Can you explain to the jury what qualifies you for such a role? 14 years of experience with livestock, Evelyn replied calmly. 4 years managing my first husband's farm, 10 years working with breeding programs, including the last 4 developing the Redmond program. I can assess conformation, evaluate bloodlines, predict breeding outcomes, and train difficult animals. I've studied agricultural science journals, corresponded with breeders across the country, and personally overseen the birth and training of over 60 foals. That's quite impressive. For a woman, the lawyer's smile was patronizing. But surely your husband makes the actual decisions? You're more of an assistant? My husband and I are partners. We make decisions together. But the breeding program is under my direct management, as documented by the deed Mr. Redmond executed giving me ownership of that aspect of the operation. A murmur ran through the courtroom. The lawyer's expression soured. A deed, you say? How convenient. Can you produce this supposed deed? I can, and did. It was filed with the county recorder's office 18 months ago. It's a matter of public record. The lawyer shifted tactics. Mrs. Redmond, isn't it true that you yourself were purchased at an auction in Council Bluffs? That you came to this marriage with nothing, no credentials, no reputation? Objection! Marcus was on his feet. Relevance. I'm establishing the witness's background and credibility, Your Honor. The judge frowned but allowed it. Evelyn took a breath, feeling every eye in the courtroom on her. Here it was. The moment her past would either vindicate or damn her. Yes, she said clearly. I was at a matrimonial agency's event in Council Bluffs. I was widowed, destitute, and seeking a practical arrangement that would ensure my survival. Mr. Redmond offered such an arrangement. We married, and I've spent the last 4 years proving that my circumstances don't define my capabilities. So you married for money. I married for survival. There's a difference. And now you claim ownership of valuable property and business operations. Isn't it possible, Mrs. Redmond, that you're an opportunist who's manipulated your husband into giving you assets you haven't actually earned? The courtroom exploded into noise. The judge banged his gavel. Marcus was shouting objections, But Evelyn just sat there, her hands folded calmly in her lap, and when the noise died down, she spoke into the silence. Mr. Dalton's lawyer wants you to believe I'm a fraud because I started with nothing. But starting with nothing doesn't make me incompetent, it makes me resourceful. He wants you to believe I've manipulated my husband, but the deed was my husband's idea, not mine. He recognized my contributions and made them official. That's not manipulation, that's partnership. She looked directly at the jury, meeting each man's eyes in turn. Those 3 horses were stolen from my stables. I can prove their lineage, their value, and the forgery on that bill of sale. But this case isn't really about horses, is it? It's about whether you gentlemen believe a woman can be competent at business. Whether a woman who started with nothing can build something worth stealing. Whether my word has value simply because I've earned the right to give it. Your Honor, the lawyer began. I'm not finished, Evelyn said firmly. Mr. Dalton wants to keep horses that don't belong to him. His lawyer wants to make this about my gender and my past rather than about theft and forgery. But the facts are simple. Those horses are mine. The bill of sale is forged, and no amount of questioning my background changes those fundamental truths. She sat back, her heart hammering, and waited. The trial continued for another day, with Marcus presenting evidence of the forgery, testimony from ranch hands who'd seen the horses stolen, and expert assessment of the animal's value. But everyone knew the verdict would come down to credibility, Dalton's word against Evelyn's. The jury deliberated for 3 hours. When they returned, the foreman stood and delivered the verdict. We find in favor of Mrs. Redmond. The horses are to be returned to the Redmond Ranch immediately, and Mr. Dalton is ordered to pay restitution for damages. Evelyn felt her knees go weak with relief. Marcus gripped her arm supportively as the courtroom buzzed with reaction. Some people looked satisfied, others disappointed, but everyone was talking about the woman who'd stood up in court and defended her own business. Silas, who'd returned from Omaha halfway through the trial and sat silently in the back of the courtroom, met her outside. He didn't say anything, just pulled her into his arms and held her while she shook with delayed reaction. You were magnificent, he said finally. Terrifying and magnificent. I was so afraid they wouldn't believe me. They'd have been fools not to. Silas pulled back to look at her face. You made them see what I've known for years, that you're formidable, Evelyn Redmond, that you've earned everything you have, and anyone who doubts that is an idiot. Some people will always doubt, Evelyn said tiredly, because I'm a woman who doesn't stay in her place. Good. Stay out of your place. Keep making people uncomfortable. Keep proving them wrong. Silas's voice was fierce. And know that I'll be right beside you, every step of the way. The victory established something important, not just the return of stolen horses, but public acknowledgement of Evelyn's competence. Newspapers covered the trial, and while some editorials condemned her for unwomanly behavior, others praised her business acumen. Orders for Redmond horses increased as buyers realized the program was managed by someone who clearly knew what she was doing, gender be damned. But the stress of the trial, combined with still recovering health, took its toll. Evelyn collapsed 3 weeks later while working in the stables, and Silas found her unconscious in an empty stall. Dr. Hartwell was summoned urgently and spent 2 hours examining her before emerging from the bedroom with a grave expression. Her body hasn't fully recovered from Sarah's birth, he told Silas. The trial, the stress, the long hours she's been keeping, it's too much too soon. Mrs. Redmond needs complete rest, Mr. Redmond. Not a few days. Months. How many months? 6, at minimum. No work, no stress, no responsibilities beyond basic self-care. If she doesn't rest now, the damage could be permanent. Silas sat heavily in the hallway chair. She won't agree to that. You know she won't. Then you need to make her agree. Dr. Hartwell's voice was stern. Your wife survived something that kills many women. She's built an impressive business and defended it in court. She's tough as nails. But even nails can break, Mr. Redmond, and if she breaks, she won't be put back together. So Silas did something he'd never done before. He made an executive decision about their partnership. He hired additional staff for the household. He brought in an experienced horse trainer named Daniel Morrison to manage daily operations of the breeding program under Evelyn's eventual oversight. He personally took over the bookkeeping and correspondence. And he told Evelyn, in no uncertain terms, that she was taking 6 months off. You can't just decide that, Evelyn protested weakly from the bed where she'd been confined for a week. The breeding program needs me. We have contracts to fulfill, clients expecting. The breeding program needs you alive and healthy, Silas interrupted. It doesn't need you dead at 32 because you worked yourself into the ground. Daniel knows horses. He can handle daily operations. I can handle the business side. What neither of us can handle is losing you. But, no buts, Evelyn. This isn't a negotiation. Silas sat on the edge of the bed, his expression implacable. You've spent 4 years building this partnership, proving yourself, fighting for respect. Now let me fight for you. Let me protect what we have by making sure you're around to enjoy it. You're being high-handed. Yes, I am. Because you're too stubborn to protect yourself, so someone has to do it for you. His hand found hers. I nearly lost you when Sarah was born. I'm not risking that again. Not for horses, not for business, not for anything. You matter more than all of it combined. Evelyn's eyes filled with tears. I'm not good at resting, Silas. I don't know how to just exist without purpose. Then we'll find you quiet purposes. Read those books you've been meaning to get to. Spend time with Thomas and Sarah. Teach me how to manage the breeding correspondence so I don't embarrass us both. But you're resting, Evelyn. That's final. So she rested, and it nearly drove her mad. The first month was the worst. She lay in bed or sat in the chair by the window, watching the ranch operations continue without her, feeling useless and unnecessary. Thomas would visit, bringing her flowers and chattering about horses. Sarah was learning to walk, tottering around the room with Mrs. Chen hovering nervously. And Silas would come home each evening with reports on the day's activities, trying to include her without letting her actually work. Daniel thinks the bay mare is ready to breed, he'd say. I thought maybe to the northern stallion. That's what your notes suggested. Not the northern stallion. His temperament's too volatile. The eastern one would be better, calmer disposition, which will balance her nervous energy. Eastern stallion, got it. Silas would make notes dutifully. Anything else? The correspondence from the Wyoming buyer. Did you tell him we won't ship until the foals are fully weaned? I did. He wasn't happy, but he accepted it. Good. And the training schedule for the yearlings? Evelyn. Silas set down his notes and looked at her seriously. You're supposed to be resting, not managing operations from bed. I'm giving advice, not managing. There's a difference. A subtle one. But he was smiling slightly. All right. A little advice. But if Dr. Hartwell asks, I'm telling him you spent the whole day reading novels and doing embroidery. I don't embroider. Then you'd better learn because that's my story and I'm sticking to it. By the 3rd month, Evelyn had adjusted to a slower pace. She spent mornings with the children, teaching Thomas his letters and watching Sarah's personality emerge. Afternoons she read, agricultural journals, yes, but also novels she'd never had time for, poetry that surprised her with its beauty. Evenings belonged to Silas, the two of them talking about everything and nothing, rediscovering the partnership that had been built on practicality but sustained by genuine affection. It was during one of these quiet evenings that Silas brought up something he'd been considering. I've been thinking about succession, he said carefully. Thomas is only 4, Sarah's 2, but eventually they'll need to understand what we're building here. You want to start training Thomas already? Evelyn looked up from her book. Not training exactly, just including. Letting him see how the ranch works, how decisions are made. You've been doing it naturally with the horses. I want to do the same with the cattle operations. He's very young, Silas. I was working my father's farm at 5, Silas replied. Not hard labor, just learning, watching, understanding that land and animals require care and attention. I think Thomas is ready for that. Evelyn studied her husband's face. You're thinking about legacy, about what happens when we're gone. I'm thinking about what we're building and who'll carry it forward. Silas set aside his own papers. The cattle operation will provide security. Your breeding program will provide excellence. Together, they'll give our children choices. They can run one or both operations, or they can sell and pursue other interests. But they should understand what they're inheriting. And Sarah? Evelyn asked quietly. What role do you see for her? Whatever role she wants. Silas's answer was immediate. You've shown me that capability isn't limited by gender, Evelyn. If Sarah has the mind for ranching, she'll ranch. If she wants something else, we'll support that too. The same goes for Thomas. I'm not building a prison, I'm building opportunities. It was in that moment that Evelyn truly understood what they'd created together. Not just a successful business or a stable household, but a foundation for their children to build their own lives on. A legacy of choice rather than obligation, partnership rather than domination. You've changed, she said softly. The man who bought me for $1 wanted an heir to carry on his empire. Now you're talking about giving our children choices. The man who bought you for $1 was a fool, Silas replied. He thought he could control everything, including the future. You've taught me that control is an illusion. The best we can do is build something strong and flexible enough to adapt to whatever comes. That's very philosophical for a cattle baron. I have a philosophical wife. It rubs off. He crossed to sit beside her, taking her hand. How are you feeling? Really? Stronger, Evelyn admitted. Still tired sometimes, but better. Dr. Hartwell was right about needing rest, even though I hated admitting it. 2 more months of taking it easy. Then we'll see about you gradually resuming responsibilities. Gradually, Evelyn. Not diving back in head first. I promise to be reasonable. I don't believe you for a second, but I appreciate the lie. Silas kissed her forehead. Come on, let's go check on the children before bed. Thomas has been teaching Sarah some very creative curse words he learned from the ranch hands, and I want to see the damage before Mrs. Chen reports it. They walked together through the house that had started as an empty monument to ambition and become a home full of life and noise and possibility. Thomas was indeed teaching his sister inappropriate vocabulary, much to Mrs. Chen's dismay and Martha's poorly concealed amusement. Sarah, barely 2, was repeating words she couldn't possibly understand with perfect clarity and obvious delight. That's your influence, Evelyn accused, watching her daughter gleefully curse at her toys. My influence would be proper grammar, Silas replied. This is pure ranch hand creativity. We'll have to have words with the men about watching their language around the children. Good luck with that. You curse more than any of them. I've gotten better since you arrived. You've gotten sneakier about it. There's a difference. They put the children to bed together, Silas reading a story while Evelyn settled them under blankets. It was domestic and ordinary and absolutely perfect. The kind of moment Silas had never imagined wanting when he'd stood in that Council Bluffs warehouse 4 years ago. Later, lying in their bed with moonlight streaming through the windows, Evelyn said quietly, Thank you for forcing me to rest. I didn't want to admit I needed it, but I did. You're welcome, though calling it forcing seems harsh. What would you call it? Aggressively suggesting, Silas offered, and Evelyn laughed. You're such a businessman. Everything's a negotiation. Not this. His arms tightened around her. This isn't a negotiation or a transaction or any kind of business arrangement. This is just us, Evelyn. The 2 people who are practical enough to build a partnership and foolish enough to fall in love despite it. Not despite it, Evelyn corrected softly. Because of it. The partnership made the love possible. The practicality gave us a foundation strong enough to support everything else. Then I'm glad I paid that $1. Best dollar you ever spent. Best dollar anyone ever spent, Silas murmured. I got you and Thomas and Sarah and a breeding program that's making us ridiculously wealthy, and a partner who makes me better than I am alone. If that's not the deal of the century, I don't know what is. Evelyn smiled in the darkness. The deal of the century started with a woman on an auction block and a man desperate enough to bid on her, and continued with 2 stubborn people who refused to settle for what everyone else expected of them. Silas kissed the top of her head. Rest now, love. Tomorrow's coming whether we're ready or not. Might as well face it rested. So they slept, partners and lovers, parents and business partners, 2 people who'd started with nothing but $1 and a handshake and built something that would endure long after they were gone. The transaction had become a transformation, and neither of them would have traded it for anything in the world. The years that followed James's birth were marked not by dramatic events, but by the quiet accumulation of ordinary moments that somehow transformed into an extraordinary life. Evelyn's recovery took longer than anyone anticipated, nearly a year before she felt truly herself again. But she used that time to reshape how she approached everything. The woman who'd spent 4 years proving herself capable finally understood she had nothing left to prove. "You're different," Susan Whitmore observed one afternoon in 1908, visiting for tea while their children played in the garden. Thomas was 7 now, Sarah 5, and James toddling after his older siblings with determined concentration. "Calmer somehow." "Nearly dying changes a person," Evelyn replied, watching James tumble in the grass and pick himself up without tears. "It clarifies priorities remarkably well." "And what are your priorities now?" Evelyn considered the question seriously. "My children growing up knowing they're loved. My husband understanding he doesn't have to carry everything alone. My work mattering to people beyond just profit margins. Living instead of just surviving." Susan smiled. "That's quite evolved from the woman who stood on an auction block 6 years ago. 6 years ago, I would have done anything to survive. Now I want to do more than just survive. I want to actually live well." Evelyn poured more tea. "There's a difference, though it took me far too long to understand it." That understanding manifested in practical changes. Evelyn expanded her library for women interested in ranching, adding books on business management, agricultural science, even legal rights. She began hosting monthly gatherings where women could share knowledge about livestock, land management, and the financial aspects of running operations. Some husbands objected. Samuel Mitchell threatened to forbid his wife from attending until Evelyn calmly pointed out that his wife's improved cattle management had increased their profits by 30%. "Mrs. Redmond is teaching women to think like business people," Mitchell complained to Silas at the bank one day. "It's unseemly." "Mrs. Redmond is teaching women to run profitable operations," Silas corrected. "If you find that unseemly, I suggest the problem lies with your perspective rather than her instruction." The breeding program continued to thrive, but Evelyn took a different approach now. She began training younger women in her methods, creating a system that didn't depend solely on her presence. One of her most promising students was Rachel Morrison, the banker's daughter, who had a remarkable eye for bloodlines and a fierce determination to prove herself in a male-dominated field. "Why are you teaching me this?" Rachel asked one afternoon as they evaluated a new mare. "I'm your competition." "Competition implies scarcity," Evelyn replied. "There's plenty of demand for quality horses. What there isn't plenty of is women who know how to breed them properly. I'd rather create colleagues than hoard knowledge." "But you built this program from nothing. Why share the methods that made you successful?" Evelyn looked at the young woman, 19 years old, brilliant, hungry for knowledge that no one else would give her, and saw herself 6 years ago. "Because someone has to break the pattern," she said quietly. "Someone has to decide that women helping women matters more than individual glory. I'm choosing to be that someone." Rachel went on to establish her own breeding program 3 years later, and rather than competing with Redmond operations, the two businesses referred clients to each other and collaborated on developing new bloodlines. It became a model that other women ranchers began to adopt, creating a network of female expertise that gradually transformed the industry. But it was with her own children that Evelyn's evolution showed most clearly. She'd survived to raise them, and she was determined to raise them well, not as extensions of their parents' ambitions, but as individuals with their own strengths and choices. Thomas absorbed everything about ranching like a sponge soaking up water. By age 10, he could evaluate cattle with an expert's eye, negotiate prices with adult buyers, and run calculations in his head that most men needed paper for. But he had his mother's practicality tempering his father's intensity, asking questions like, "But is it sustainable? And what happens to the land in 20 years?" That showed he was thinking beyond immediate profit. "He's going to be formidable," Silas said one evening, watching Thomas work through a complex breeding projection. "Probably better at this than I ever was." "He has the advantage of being raised by parents who work together rather than against each other," Evelyn replied. "That changes everything." Sarah proved to be a different creature entirely. She had no interest in cattle or horses, but she devoured books the way Thomas devoured ranching knowledge. By age 8, she was reading at a level that shocked her tutors and asking questions about history and science that most adults couldn't answer. "I want to go to university," Sarah announced at age 11, as if this were a perfectly reasonable goal for a girl. I want to study medicine and become a doctor. The silence around the dinner table was absolute. Thomas looked shocked. James, only 6, didn't understand why this was extraordinary, and Silas and Evelyn exchanged a long look that communicated volumes. That will be difficult, Silas said finally. Most medical schools don't accept women. Some do, Sarah countered. I researched it. There's one in Philadelphia and another in Boston. Both accept qualified female applicants. Sarah, Evelyn said gently, even if you got in, you'd face enormous prejudice. Female doctors aren't taken seriously. You'd spend your whole career fighting for respect. Like you did? Sarah's eyes were bright with challenge. You built a breeding program when everyone said women couldn't. You defended it in court when they tried to steal from you. You taught other women when men said you shouldn't. How is me becoming a doctor different? Evelyn looked at her daughter, fierce, brilliant, unbending, and felt her throat tighten. It's not different, she admitted. It's exactly the same. And if you want it, truly want it, we'll find a way to make it happen. Evelyn, Silas began. No, she cut him off firmly. We didn't raise our children to settle for what's expected. We raised them to pursue what they're capable of. If Sarah wants to be a doctor, we support that. I'll face the same prejudice you faced, Sarah said seriously. Maybe worse. But Mama, you showed me that prejudice can be overcome with competence and determination. You showed me that being a woman doesn't mean accepting limitations others try to impose. I also showed you that fighting those battles is exhausting and painful, Evelyn replied. I want you to understand what you're choosing, Sarah. It won't be easy. Nothing worth doing ever is. Sarah's words could have come from either parent. But I'd rather fight for something I care about than have an easy life doing something meaningless. So Sarah was prepared for medical school, though she was still years too young to attend. Evelyn found tutors who'd work with a female student. Silas used his connections to arrange observation opportunities with doctors in Omaha. And Sarah absorbed it all with the same fierce intelligence she'd inherited from both parents. James, the youngest, remained something of a mystery. He was quieter than his siblings, more observant than active. He'd sit for hours watching his father work or his mother train horses, absorbing everything but revealing little of his own thoughts. What do you want to be when you grow up? Evelyn asked him one day when he was 8 years old. James considered the question with characteristic seriousness. I want to be fair, he said finally. Fair? You mean like a judge? Like someone who makes sure people are treated right. Thomas will run the ranch because he's good at it. Sarah will be a doctor because she's smart and determined. But someone needs to make sure workers are paid properly, and women get opportunities, and people who start with nothing get chances. He looked up at his mother with those dark, serious eyes. Like Papa gave you a chance when you had nothing. Someone needs to keep doing that. Evelyn pulled her youngest son into her arms and held him while her heart cracked open. This child who'd nearly cost her everything, who she'd fought so hard to bring into the world, he'd inherited the best parts of both his parents. Silas's determination paired with her empathy, her practicality combined with his underlying sense of justice. Then you'll be fair, she promised. Whatever that looks like when you're grown, we'll help you become it. The children grew and the ranch grew with them. Not in the explosive expansion Silas had once envisioned, but in sustainable, thoughtful development. Thomas gradually took over more cattle operations as Silas stepped back, bringing fresh ideas while respecting established methods. The breeding program remained Evelyn's domain, though she continued training other women to carry the work forward. It was in 1916, when Thomas was 15 and already running significant portions of the cattle operation, that Silas fell ill. It started as a persistent cough he dismissed as nothing. By the time Dr. Hartwell, now in his 70s but still practicing, examined him, the pneumonia had settled deep in his lungs, the same lungs that had been weakened by years of brutal winters and prairie dust. He needs complete rest, Dr. Hartwell told Evelyn bluntly. No work, no stress, no getting out of bed until this passes. And Mrs. Redmond, it may not pass. At his age, with his history, pneumonia like this can be fatal. Evelyn, now 42 years old and stronger than she'd been in years, simply nodded and began organizing the household for crisis. Thomas was pulled from his duties to sit with his father. Sarah, now 14 and already formidable, took over managing communications with business associates. James, at 11, kept his younger siblings occupied and the household running smoothly. And Evelyn sat beside Silas's bed, holding his hand through fever and delirium, and refused to consider the possibility of losing him. "You can't leave me," she told him during one of his brief lucid moments. "We had an agreement, remember? Partnership means we face things together." "Already faced more together than I expected," Silas rasped, his breathing labored. "Built something good, didn't we?" "We built something extraordinary, and you don't get to abandon it now." Evelyn's voice was fierce. "You made me promise to survive childbirth for our children's sake. Now I'm making you promise to survive this for the same reason. Thomas needs to learn more from you. Sarah needs your support for medical school. James needs to see that fairness and strength can coexist, and I need my partner. Best dollar I ever spent." Silas's attempt at a smile turned into a coughing fit that left him gasping. "Best dollar either of us ever spent," Evelyn corrected when he could breathe again. "Now stop talking and conserve your strength. You're going to get through this because I'm not accepting any other outcome." For 3 weeks, Silas hovered between recovery and death. The fever would break, then return. His breathing would ease, then worsen. Dr. Hartwell visited daily, trying every treatment available, but ultimately it was Silas's own stubborn determination and Evelyn's refusal to let him surrender that pulled him through. "You're lucky to be alive," Dr. Hartwell said when Silas finally turned the corner toward recovery. "Another few days of that fever, and we'd have lost you." "Couldn't die," Silas replied, his voice still weak but steady. "My wife wouldn't allow it." The illness changed him, though. He was 64 years old, and the pneumonia had taken something essential from his strength. He recovered enough to walk and talk and participate in ranch decisions, but the endless 16-hour days were done. The driving ambition that had built an empire was tempered by the reality of mortality. "Thomas needs to take over more," he admitted to Evelyn one evening, several months into his recovery. "I can't run this operation the way I used to." "Then don't," Evelyn replied practically. "Run it differently. Be the advisor instead of the operator. Teach instead of doing. You have decades of knowledge, Silas. Use it to prepare our son instead of killing yourself trying to do everything alone." So Silas became a mentor rather than an operator, teaching Thomas not just the mechanics of ranching but the philosophy behind their methods. The importance of treating workers fairly, the value of sustainable practices over short-term profit, the necessity of adapting to change rather than resisting it. "Your grandfather built this ranch through sheer force of will," Silas told Thomas one afternoon as they surveyed the northern pastures together. "I expanded it through determination and your mother's partnership. You'll take it further through intelligence and innovation. Each generation builds on what came before while adapting to what's needed now." "What if I make mistakes?" Thomas asked. He was 17 now, tall and serious, carrying the weight of future responsibility on his young shoulders. "You will make mistakes. Everyone does. The question is whether you learn from them." Silas looked at his oldest son, the heir he desperately wanted, who'd become so much more than just an heir. "I made plenty of mistakes, Thomas. I chose 2 wrong wives before I found the right partner. I nearly worked myself to death building something I didn't know how to enjoy. I almost lost your mother because I wanted more children than we could safely have. Learn from my mistakes as well as my successes." "And what was your greatest success?" Thomas asked. Silas didn't hesitate. "Paying $1 for a woman everyone else dismissed as worthless. Everything good in my life came from that one decision. You, your siblings, the partnership that made all of this meaningful. Remember that, Thomas. The best investments aren't always the ones that look promising. Sometimes they're the ones nobody else values." In 1920, Sarah left for medical school in Philadelphia at age 18. The farewell was tearful, though Sarah herself remained composed. "I'll write every week," she promised, embracing her mother on the train platform. "And I'll come home for summers when I can, and I'll make you proud, Mama." "You already make me proud," Evelyn replied, holding her daughter tight. "Every single day. Now go show those professors what a woman raised by partners can accomplish." Sarah did exactly that, graduating at the top of her class 4 years later and returning to Nebraska to open a practice that served rural communities. She became known for treating everyone regardless of ability to pay, for believing women when they described their symptoms, for combining the latest medical knowledge with genuine compassion. "She's more successful than I ever was," Evelyn said proudly when Sarah's practice expanded to include 3 other female doctors. "Different kind of success," Silas corrected. "You built a business. Sarah's building a legacy of care. Both matter." James, true to his childhood declaration, studied law and went into public service. At 25, he was elected county attorney and immediately began prosecuting cases of worker exploitation and fraud that other attorneys had ignored. He married a schoolteacher named Grace, who shared his passion for justice, and together they became advocates for the powerless. "3 children," Silas said one evening in 1929, sitting on the porch with Evelyn and watching the sunset paint the prairie gold and red. 3 completely different paths. Did we do right by them? "We gave them choices," Evelyn replied. She was 55 now, her auburn hair threaded with silver, her face lined with years but still beautiful. "We showed them that success looks different for everyone. We taught them competence and compassion." "Yes, Silas, we did right by them." "Your dollar's worth more than mine," he said, taking her hand. He was 77, slowed by age and illness, but still sharp-minded. "I bought a wife. You bought a future for our children that neither of us could have built alone." "We bought it together," Evelyn corrected. "That's what partnership means." They sat in comfortable silence, 2 people who'd started with nothing but a dollar and a handshake and built something that would endure long past their own lives. The ranch was thriving under Thomas's management. Sarah's medical practice was serving thousands of patients. James's legal work was changing laws. And beyond their own children, they'd influenced dozens of other lives. The women Evelyn had trained, the workers Silas had treated fairly, the community they'd both served. "Do you ever regret it?" Silas asked quietly. "The auction, the practical arrangement, starting with so little?" Evelyn turned to look at him. This man who'd shocked a warehouse by bidding $1, who'd given her partnership when she expected only survival, who'd loved her through pregnancy and prejudice and near death. This man who'd been cold and driven and alone, who'd somehow learned to be warm and collaborative and part of something larger than himself. "Never," she said firmly. "Not once." "You?" "Never," Silas echoed. "Best dollar I ever spent, best decision I ever made. I set out to buy an heir and got a family instead. Got a partner who made me better. Got children who'll change the world. Got a life worth living rather than just an empire to maintain." "The empire's not bad either," Evelyn teased gently. "The empire's fine, but without you, it would have been meaningless." Silas raised her hand to his lips. "Without you, I'd have been a rich, successful, miserable old man who died alone. Instead, I'm a rich, successful, happy old man who has everything that matters." "Smooth talker," Evelyn accused, but she was smiling. "Only took me 27 years to learn how," Silas replied. "You're a patient teacher." They watched the sun sink below the horizon, turning the vast prairie into shadows and whispers. The land Silas had bought with ruthless determination. The horses Evelyn had bred with careful science. The home they'd built together from empty rooms and careful partnership. "What happens to it all when we're gone?" Evelyn asked, not morbidly, but practically. "Thomas will run the ranch, but what about the rest? The breeding program, the women's library, all the pieces we've built?" "Thomas has my business sense tempered by your compassion," Silas replied. "He'll keep the ranch profitable while treating it as a trust rather than just property. Sarah will continue healing people who need it most. James will fight for those without power. And all of them will teach their children what we taught them, that wealth brings responsibility, that success means helping others succeed, that the best legacies are measured in lives improved rather than dollars accumulated." "That's quite a legacy for a dollar investment." "That's quite a legacy for 2 people who refused to let circumstances define them," Silas corrected. "You stood on that auction block with nothing, and you turned that nothing into this. I had everything money could buy, and it was worthless until I had you to share it with. Together, we built something that'll outlast us both." He was right, though neither of them would live to see how right he was. Silas died in his sleep in 1932 at age 80, his hand clasped in Evelyn's. He went peacefully, a man who'd made peace with his past and created a future he was proud of. The funeral drew people from across 3 states: business associates, ranch workers, families whose lives had been changed by his fairness and Evelyn's generosity. He was a hard man, Thomas said in his eulogy, but a fair one. He demanded excellence and rewarded it appropriately. He built an empire not through exploitation, but through partnership, with his workers, with his wife, with everyone who contributed to his success. That's why this ranch will endure. He built it on foundations that last. Evelyn listened to her son praise his father and felt the loss settle into her bones. 28 years of partnership ended. But what a 28 years it had been. What a life they'd built together from that unlikely beginning. She lived another 14 years without him, managing the breeding program and the women's library, watching her grandchildren grow, supporting her children's various ventures. She expanded the library to include not just agricultural knowledge, but history, science, literature. She funded scholarships for young women seeking education. She became, in her own right, a force for change in a region that had once dismissed her as worthless. When reporters interviewed her, and they did, increasingly, as the auction bride story became famous, she always spoke honestly about her beginnings. "I was purchased for $1, she'd say without shame. I could have let that define me as worthless. Instead, I chose to see it as an investment I needed to earn a return on. So I worked, and I proved myself, and I built something that mattered. Not despite my circumstances, but because of them. Because starting with nothing means you understand the value of everything." "And Mr. Redman?" they'd ask. "What was he like?" "He was a hard man who learned to be soft in the right moments," Evelyn would reply, her eyes distant with memory. "A driven man who learned when to rest. A lonely man who learned to open his heart. He started as my employer and became my partner, and ended as my love. The progression wasn't smooth, but it was real. That's what mattered. It was real." In 1944, Sarah came to visit her mother, who was now 70 years old and increasingly frail. They sat in the library Evelyn had built, surrounded by books and memories. "Mama, I've been asked to write an article about women in medicine," Sarah said. "They want me to include your story as inspiration." "May I?" "My story?" Evelyn looked surprised. "I'm not a doctor." "No, but you're a woman who built a successful business when that was considered impossible, who defended her work in court, who trained other women to follow in her footsteps, who showed daughters like me that we didn't have to accept limitations others tried to impose. That's worth writing about." Evelyn considered this. "Will you tell the truth? All of it. The auction, the practical arrangement, the fact that your father and I married for survival rather than love?" "I'll tell the truth," Sarah promised, "including the fact that you turned survival into something extraordinary, that practical arrangements can become love stories, that starting with $1 doesn't determine your ending." "Then yes," Evelyn agreed. "Tell the story. If it helps one woman believe she's worth more than what others value her at, it's worth sharing." The article was published in a major medical journal and picked up by newspapers across the country. "The Dollar Bride: How One Woman's Refusal to Accept Her Circumstances Changed the American West." It told the story honestly. The auction, the bargain, the partnership, the legacy. Letters poured in from women who'd read the story and felt inspired. Women stuck in bad marriages who found courage to leave. Women starting businesses who drew strength from Evelyn's example. Women fighting for education or property rights or simple respect who saw that change was possible. "You've become famous," Thomas said, visiting with his own children to show grandmother the newspaper articles. "I've become useful," Evelyn corrected. "There's a difference. Fame is about attention. Usefulness is about impact. I'd rather be useful." "You're both," her grandson said. He was 16, already working the ranch, already showing the Redmond combination of intelligence and integrity. "You're famous because you were useful first. That's the legacy you and Grandpa built." Evelyn Redmond died peacefully in her sleep on a warm September night in 1946, at age 72. She was surrounded by her children and grandchildren, in the house where she'd spent more than 4 decades building a life that mattered. Her funeral was even larger than Silas's had been. The governor attended. Dozens of women whose lives she'd influenced came to pay respects. Her children spoke of her strength, her wisdom, her refusal to be diminished by circumstance. But it was James, the youngest, who captured her essence best. My mother was purchased for $1 at a time when women were valued less than livestock, he said, his voice carrying across the crowded church. She could have accepted that valuation. She could have lived quietly, grateful for survival, never pushing for more. Instead, she built a breeding program that changed the industry. She trained women who went on to build their own successes. She raised children who believed in justice and compassion. She turned $1 into a legacy that will echo for generations. He paused, looking at the simple casket where his mother lay. The world told her she was worthless. One man disagreed and paid $1 to prove it. Together, they built something extraordinary. Not just a successful business, but a model for partnership, for treating people with dignity, for refusing to accept that circumstances define destiny. That's her legacy. That's what we carry forward. The ranch continued under Thomas's management, then his children's, growing more successful with each generation. Sarah's medical practice expanded into a network of rural clinics serving thousands. James's legal work led to landmark cases protecting workers' rights and women's property ownership. And the women's library Evelyn founded became a center for female education and empowerment, training generations of women in business, agriculture, and professional skills. It was renamed the Evelyn Redmond Center for Women's Advancement in 1950, and by the end of the century, it had served over 10,000 women. The story of the Dollar Bride became legend, told and retold with increasing embellishment, but the essential truth remained unchanged. Two practical people made a practical arrangement and transformed it into something extraordinary through partnership, perseverance, and the refusal to let others define their worth. In 2002, on the 100th anniversary of that auction in Council Bluffs, the Redmond family gathered to commemorate their founding. They stood in the library that bore Evelyn's name, surrounded by portraits of the woman who'd started with nothing and built everything. Thomas's great-granddaughter, herself a successful rancher, addressed the gathering. 100 years ago, my great-great-grandmother stood on an auction block and was purchased for $1. Today, the enterprise she helped build is worth millions. The breeding program she founded is nationally recognized. The Women's Center that bears her name has changed thousands of lives. But the real legacy isn't measured in dollars or awards or recognition. She gestured to the crowd, ranchers and doctors and lawyers and educators, men and women of all ages, all connected to the Redmond legacy in some way. The real legacy is this: a family that believes in partnership over domination, a business that treats workers with dignity, a community that gives women opportunities, a tradition of using wealth to create more opportunities rather than just accumulating more wealth. That's what $1 bought. That's what two people built together, and that's what we're called to carry forward. Not the empire they created, but the values they embedded in its foundation. The gathering raised glasses to Evelyn and Silas Redmond, to the partnership that started with $1 and ended with a dynasty, to the proof that worth isn't determined by price tags, but by what people choose to build with whatever resources they're given. And somewhere, in whatever place souls go when bodies wear out, two people who'd started as strangers, become partners, evolved into lovers, and ended as legends looked down on their legacy and were satisfied. They'd paid $1 for survival and earned a lifetime of meaning. They'd started with nothing but determination and built something that would endure for generations. They'd refused to accept the limitations others imposed, and in doing so, expanded possibilities for everyone who came after. The dollar had long since been spent, lost to time and history. But what it purchased, partnership, family, legacy, hope, remained invaluable and undiminished by the passage of years. That was the true worth of the bargain struck in Council Bluffs in 1902. Not the dollar itself, but what two people chose to make of the opportunity that dollar represented. A transaction became a transformation. A purchase became a partnership. $1 became a dynasty. And it all started with a woman on an auction block who refused to believe she was worthless, and a man desperate enough to believe she might be priceless. Together, They proved that the best investments aren't measured in dollars, but in the lives changed, the opportunities created, and the love built from the most unlikely foundations. That was the legacy of the dollar bride. Not the price paid, but the value created. And it was priceless.